Evening, lads. Mason here. Tonight we are revisiting one of my favorite cases, the folklore of the mimic. Mimics are among the most frightening entities recorded in paranormal folklore. Over the years, through my own research and conversations with people who have experienced strange phenomena, I've come across countless accounts from people who swear they have seen them, heard them, or encountered something that appeared to perfectly imitate the voice of someone they knew. I first covered this case some time ago, but that original episode was later removed along with the rest of the first season of the Fall Asleep podcast. Recently, a number of horror narration channels have also been demonetized, and this channel remains unmonetized as well. I've spent years researching paranormal cases, folklore, and unexplained phenomena, and regardless of monetization or whatever problems may come with YouTube, I have no intention of stopping. I will continue searching through these stories, digging into old cases and trying to understand what people have experienced. If you would like to directly support the Fall Asleep podcast, you can do so through Patreon using the link in the description below. The Fall Asleep podcast Patreon gives you access to thousands of hours of episodes and more than 100 cases like the one you're about to hear. You will find the complete first and second seasons of the Fall Asleep podcast entirely ad-free, along with early access to every new upload, often weeks before it appears publicly. Most importantly, Patreon is also where you will find exclusive cases that are simply too disturbing, strange, or controversial for YouTube. The community over on Patreon is growing every day, and people there have really been enjoying the exclusive cases. Here is a small sample from one of those Patreon exclusive episodes. In 2017, one of the most extraordinary paranormal stories of the modern internet age began unfolding in real time. An illustrator living in New York City claimed that the spirit of a dead child had entered his life, and over the months that followed, thousands of people watched as his apartment became the center of a haunting that seemed to grow more disturbing with every update. The boy appeared first in dreams, with a badly damaged head and a warning attached to his name, and after Adam Ellis broke the one rule he had been given, the disturbances seemed to follow him into waking life. The story became an obsession online, with people waiting for each new post, analyzing every photograph, and arguing over whether Adam Ellis was documenting something genuinely supernatural or pulling off one of the most convincing paranormal hoaxes ever seen. This is Dear David, one of the most famous modern hauntings ever documented online. The full episode is available now, exclusively on the Fall Asleep podcast Patreon. Click the Patreon link in the description below to listen to the complete case. Dear David is the latest addition to our growing library of Patreon exclusive episodes, joining 7 other terrifying and controversial paranormal cases, available only to members. You will also unlock the complete archive of more than 100 episodes, ad-free listening, and early access to every new release. The Fall Asleep podcast on Patreon is your Netflix for scary podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe. Now back to the video. Evening, lads. Mason here. Welcome back to the Fall Asleep podcast, your quiet place for the haunted, the forgotten, and the things that sound too close to home. We've explored many hauntings together, restless houses, possessions, and folklore. But tonight's investigation is different. There's a sound almost everyone knows, the voice of someone you love, a parent calling from another room, a partner saying your name just right. It's the sound that tells you the world is safe, but then it happens. That same voice calls from the dark, every syllable right, every detail perfect, except it can't be them. They're gone. They passed on years ago, or they're miles away. They're out, or asleep in the next room. It's not them. Something or someone else is pretending to be them. And the moment you realize that, the air changes, because whatever's calling you knows exactly who you trust most and how to sound like them. Tonight we investigate mimicry. Every culture on Earth has warned about this, the false familiar, the spirit that borrows the voices of the living. It's older than any religion, older than language itself, and it's still being heard today. Tonight we follow those voices across centuries, from the forests of Eastern Europe to the deserts of the American Southwest, from whispers in Victorian houses to recordings in modern hospitals. A story about the one fear no one can outrun, when something in the dark is calling you. Before we begin, a quick thank you to everyone supporting the channel. The goal is 20,000 subscribers, and we're getting close. Every new listener keeps these stories alive. So if you haven't yet, hit that button. It truly helps. Now, turn off the lights, take a breath, and listen carefully. This is the oldest deception in human history.
Ah, I've been expecting you. You're listening to the Fall Asleep podcast.
Deep in the hush of midnight, when the world falls still, there comes a voice. Perhaps it calls your name from just beyond the door, spoken in the familiar cadence of someone you love. A parent, a child, a dear friend. At first, it is almost comforting in its normalcy. It is the right voice, but in the wrong place. You pause in the darkness, heart beginning to thud, and ask yourself, should I answer? The air is heavy and silent now, save for that voice drifting out of shadow. It calls again, urgent and eerily clear. You know you are alone in the house, yet the call persists, gentle and ordinary. A voice you trust, sounding exactly as it should, except it should not be here at all. In that moment, the ordinary turns to dread. A wave of cold realization washes over you. Something unknown has found a way to sound like someone you love. So begins one of humanity's oldest and most intimate nightmares. This is not a fear of a roaring monster or a ghastly apparition, but of a betrayal of sound and trust. It's the terror of an unseen presence that wears the voice of the familiar, luring you by exploiting your deepest bonds of affection and security. We call this phenomenon mimicry. In paranormal lore, it is the imitation of a voice or form by something that is decidedly not the person it pretends to be. Unlike horrors that assault our eyes, this one slips in through our ears, subtle and insidious. A mimic doesn't need to break down your door. It's already inside your mind the moment you recognize that voice. This podcast is an exploration of those voices in the dark, a journey through folklore, historical accounts, and modern encounters with the uncanny imitator. All that follows is drawn from real traditions and witness testimonies, from ancient myths to 21st century experiences. The intent here is not to spin campfire fiction, but to immerse ourselves in the recorded fears and lore surrounding these vocal doppelgangers. In many cultures and stories, they are a warning that the senses can deceive, that even the sound of one's own name spoken aloud can lead one into peril if it comes from an unknown tongue. We will trace this motif from its roots in primal human fears, the trusting response to a friendly voice turned suddenly against us. Through legends of every corner of the world, we will hear of forest spirits that echo our calls, demons that whisper in loved ones' voices, and ghosts that answer when no living person is there. Why does it matter? Because a voice is more than a sound, it is a connection. We know the voices of our family from infancy. We memorize the tones of our friends. A familiar voice means safety. To use that against us is a particularly poignant horror. It's the violation of trust at a most fundamental level. A monster that snarls may frighten our bodies, but a monster that sounds like our mother calling us home terrifies something deeper. It wounds our very sense of reality and security. Such an entity turns our own comfort against us. It is the false familiar, the friend who isn't, the trusted call that leads you astray. The betrayal cuts deeper than claws ever could. In the following podcast, we journey chronologically and geographically from the earliest whispers of this fear in ancient times through the rich tapestry of folklore in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and into modern documented hauntings and investigations. We will analyze why these mimic encounters provoke such dread and what they might signify about human psychology and cultural values. But make no mistake, we will not rationalize away the horror. Whether one believes these voices are malicious spirits, trickster demons, or the echoes of our own minds, the stories carry a chilling power that persists. Folklore cautions us that a voice heard in an empty darkness is to be distrusted, that sometimes our name spoken aloud is a trap. So listen closely to these accounts, but hold fast to your skepticism when the night is still and a voice calls to you from the shadows. Recall the old wisdom shared quietly around hearths. Not every voice that sounds familiar comes from a friend. As we proceed from the ancient world to the present day, keep one image in mind: a lone person standing in a dark, silent place, hearing someone dear call out, and feeling first a surge of relief, then the icy clutch of terror as they realize the beloved voice should not be there. This ancient fear has worn many faces and spoken in many tongues, but its essence remains. When something unknown sounds like us, how do we answer? Let us step into the dark then and hear the first echoes of this timeless nightmare. Since time immemorial, the human voice has been a beacon of safety. Imagine our early ancestors in the wild nights of prehistory. The cry of a tribe member would guide the lost back to the fire. A mother's voice would soothe frightened children in the dark. Evolutionarily, we are tuned to find comfort in familiar voices. A gentle voice in a night forest could mean rescue. A known call across a field means you are not alone. We carry that primal assurance: if I hear someone I know, I am safe. Our brains are remarkably adept at recognizing voices, even fragments of them, latching onto that recognition with relief. It is perhaps why hearing one's name spoken grabs attention so immediately. It's an ancient signal that someone seeks us, that we matter, that help or companionship is near. This instinct is deeply ingrained, part of what has allowed social groups to survive and communicate in darkness. Now consider the flip side. What if that fundamental signal of safety is mimicked and misused? A monster jumping from the bushes is terrifying, yes, but on a very basic, known level. You see a threat, you understand it as other. But a voice that appears friendly and familiar before leading you into danger strikes at a different kind of fear. It's the collapse of an evolutionary trust. The very thing meant to reassure is turned against us. Unlike a visible monster, a mimicked voice betrays from within. It is like a trusted friend suddenly flashing a predator's smile. The emotional wound is deeper because the defense, our trust in the familiar, becomes the weapon. When people recount experiences of hearing a loved one's voice in an empty house or a friend calling from an empty wood, they often describe a moment of confusion, even joy, before the dread sinks in. That transition from comfort to horror is uniquely devastating. It leaves one not only afraid of an external threat, but doubting one's own senses and bonds. Indeed, researchers of the paranormal note that mimic encounters exploit intimacy, turning one's own mind into a battlefield of uncertainty. The safety we instinctively associated with a human voice collapses into a free fall of terror and mistrust. The roots of this fear may extend to natural experiences that puzzled early humans. Long before scientific understanding, our ancestors noticed the uncanny phenomenon of echoes. Yell into a canyon and a ghostly version of your own voice calls back. Who was that, answering from the void? Many ancient cultures personified echoes as spirits, invisible mockers repeating one's words. In Greek mythology, the nymph Echo was cursed to only mimic others' speech, a disembodied voice haunting the mountains. Before the concept of sound reflection was known, hearing one's shout returned from the landscape must have been deeply eerie. Likewise, nighttime in the wilderness brings other echoes. Certain animals can mimic human-like sounds. For example, hyenas and some birds produce uncanny cries. To a lone traveler hearing a strange call that resembles a human voice, the effect is unsettling. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder recorded tales of the crocotta, a mythical wolf dog said to imitate human voices at night to lure people out, literally calling to them by name. This likely sprang from observations of hyenas, whose laughter-like cackles and childlike wails spooked people, embellished into legend. Here we see one of the oldest mimic monsters, a creature not frightening by appearance but by voice, using the false friendly call as bait. Across early societies, whenever a mysterious voice was heard, in a lonely cave, across a dark bog, or amid trees, it invited supernatural interpretation. The world was alive with spirits for our ancestors, and a voice with no visible source could be nothing less than a spirit attempting contact or trickery. The fear of deception by sound thus likely dates back to our first nights huddled around fires. Pre-modern minds imbued the natural echoes and inexplicable calls with intention. A peculiar example comes from the Odyssey. The hero Menelaus recounts how during the Trojan War, Helen, then under Troy's walls, mimicked the voices of Greek soldiers' wives, calling out from the darkness to tempt them into revealing themselves, a cunning ploy attributed to either Helen's own craft or a god's trick. Though part of a mythic tale, it highlights an ancient understanding that a voice can be a weapon of deception. The idea unsettled listeners then as it does now. In absence of science, early peoples turned to folklore to explain uncanny voices. Some saw them as echo spirits, like the Japanese did, as we shall soon explore, or as demons in the woods. Others took them as omens. For instance, a disembodied voice calling one's name might portend death or ill fate in many traditions. To the pre-modern ear, a voice without a body was inherently supernatural. If it was repeating known sounds, surely it understood and intended something. Perhaps it wanted to lure the unwary off the safe path. Perhaps it was a playful sprite teasing travelers. Or it could be the dead calling out to the living. In every case, though, there was a sense of danger or at least uncanniness in the phenomenon. The natural comfort of voice was replaced by the uncanny, the wrongness of a familiar sound out of context. From these experiences and interpretations sprang a rich trove of folklore about entities that impersonate voices. It is telling that some of humanity's earliest ghost and monster stories revolve not around what was seen, but what was heard. The voice is intimate. It doesn't need to break through our eyes' defenses or appear before us. It goes straight into our ears and into our mind's recognition. We will see time and again how cultures around the world seized upon this vulnerability. The earliest roots of the fear of mimicry lie in that uneasy awareness that something inhuman could hide behind a human voice. As we leave these roots and venture into specific folklore traditions, keep in mind this fundamental dissonance that underpins all mimic tales. The safety of the human voice turned into a lie. From those first fireside fears, the story travels into recorded history, into the forests and mountains of Europe, where echoes and voices in the dark took on names of their own. In the deep green gloom of ancient Slavic forests, generations of villagers told of the Leshy, a capricious forest spirit with many powers, chief among them the gift of mimicry. The Leshy was said to guard the woods and often played tricks on those who wandered there without respect. Hunters and woodcutters who vanished in the woods were sometimes whispered to have been led astray by the Leshy's cunning. How? By imitating the voices of people they knew, calling their names from deeper in the thicket. A hunter might hear his companions seemingly shout for help from behind a distant tree and rush to assist, only to find nothing, now hopelessly lost. Or a child picking berries might hear her mother's voice beckoning her further into the timber, far from the path. The Leshy could copy the tone perfectly, a friend's laughter echoing between the pines, a loved one's cry coming from a dark hollow. One 19th-century Russian folk tale describes a traveler who, while seeking a missing friend, heard the friend's exact voice calling out every so often, always a little further ahead. The traveler followed and followed, deeper into swamp and thorn, until at last he came upon a mossy glade where sat the Leshy, grinning like a lost friend returned, before it vanished, leaving him hopelessly lost. He mimicked my friend to the last detail, the man would later recount in hushed tones, even laughed like him. I was fooled until the moment I saw those pale eyes. The folklore notes that a Leshy might also appear in familiar guises, sometimes taking on the shape of a known person, but always with some slight imperfection, clothing worn backwards, or an unsettling grin. Often, though, it needed no shape at all. Its voice was enough to do the mischief. In countless tales across Russia, Ukraine, Poland, and surrounding regions, people insisted that if you heard your name called from the woods, you must not answer and not follow. It was likely the Leshy luring you. Do not respond, warned peasants to their children. The human voice is meant to be a guide, but under the Leshy's spell, it becomes a will-o'-the-wisp, leading you ever deeper into bewilderment. As one scholarly summary puts it, Leshy are terribly mischievous beings. They imitate voices of people familiar to wanderers and lure them off track in the woods. The Leshy's repertoire was broad. It could imitate not only human voices, but also a baby's cries or the distressed call of a person in peril. Who wouldn't run toward the sound of a crying child in the forest? But such mercy would be a mistake. You'd be running toward the arms of the spirit. Once thoroughly lost and panicked, The unfortunate soul might then be toyed with by the leshy, branches scratching, laughter circling on the breeze, or even kidnapped outright. Many variations of the tale exist, but they all impart the same lesson. A voice in the forest cannot be trusted, no matter how familiar it sounds. Yet, lest one think the leshy is purely evil, Slavic folklore presents it as more complex, a trickster and guardian rather than a demon. People who treated the forest respectfully might never encounter it, or if they did, it might help them. But those who were greedy or careless were prime targets for its leading astray pranks. In the stories, a clever wayfarer could sometimes break the enchantment. One common folk remedy if you suspect a leshy's tricks is to turn your clothes inside out or backwards and wear your shoes on opposite feet. This seemingly absurd act was believed to confuse the spirit and break its hold, perhaps because it symbolically reverses the wrong direction the leshy set you on. Indeed, wearing one's coat backwards was a known precaution when traveling through deep woods, a silent message to the leshy. I know your tricks. A more direct defense was to curse or use the sign of the cross. As some tales mention, the leshy hates profanity and holy names. But the simplest protection of all was awareness. Never follow a disembodied voice, no matter how much it sounds like your comrade. As we move westward in Europe, we will find that this basic warning echoes in various forms. Beyond the Slavic world, numerous European folk tales recount travelers hearing phantom voices. The British Isles, for instance, harbored stories of eerie laughter in lonely glens and voices of the unseen calling out on misty moors. While not always an intentional mimic of a specific person, these disembodied voices carried their own danger. In Celtic folklore, one finds the concept of voices on the wind. Some Scottish and Irish tales tell of people who followed the sound of someone calling their name, only to find themselves near perilous cliffs or deep in bogs as if led by a malign fairy. If the person was lucky, they realized at the final moment that the voice was not real and stepped back from the brink. The cautionary phrase in Gaelic legend is along the lines of, "Answer not when your name is whispered from empty air." It was believed fairies or malevolent spirits might call a person's name to lure them away, either to abduct them into the fairy realm or simply to trick them into getting lost or harmed. The phenomenon of echoes in mountainous regions also gave rise to stories. The Swiss Alps, for example, had legends of mountain spirits that would respond when called, sometimes mocking the caller. High, eerie laughter would bounce back from rock faces after a traveler yodeled a greeting. Locals might attribute that to ghosts of the mountain. In a dark twist, there are European ghost stories where a bereaved person hears the voice of a departed loved one, calling to them from a graveyard or a ruined castle, and if they follow it, they meet a tragic fate or vanish. These were likely morality tales or expressions of grief, but they reinforce the motif. A voice may sound sweet and personal, but if it comes at an odd hour or place, dread lies behind it. Northern Europe had its shapeshifters as well, entities like the Scandinavian huldra, or nuken. The huldra, a forest spirit appearing as a beautiful woman, usually ensnared men visually, but some say she could sing with a voice that hypnotized. The nuken, or neck, was a water spirit often said to lure victims to rivers by calling out in the night. While typically known for music, like violin playing to enchant listeners, some tales suggest the nuken could cry for help in a drowning person's voice to draw rescuers, who then become the next victims in the water. In one Swedish legend, a farmer hears what sounds like his brother shouting from the riverside at dusk. He approaches only for an icy hand to drag him toward the water. He narrowly escapes and realizes no one was there except the neck. Similarly, a Danish story tells of a shape-shifting mare, night spirit, that stood outside a house imitating the voice of the farmer's wife to get him to open the door on a stormy night. He almost did, until noticing the silhouette was wrong and the voice curiously flat. This interplay of voice and shape runs through European lore. In the winds of Germanic and British folklore rides the spectral cavalcade of the Wild Hunt, a stormy host of ghostly hunters or damned souls coursing the sky at night. People claim to hear the Wild Hunt long before seeing it. The distant echoing horns, the baying of spectral hounds, and yes, sometimes voices shouting or calling names. One English folktale from Dartmoor claims that on certain nights the Wild Hunt swept through the woods. A lone traveller heard his own name called in a booming voice from above the tree line, as if the lead hunter were beckoning him to join the chase. Terrified, the traveler flung himself face down and did not respond, for to answer was to be taken. The wild hunt passed overhead, and he survived. Here the voice is not a gentle mimic of a loved one, but it is personal, the very sound of one's name by an unseen force, which in itself was considered a summons not to be answered. Across Europe the refrain is recognizable. Mysterious voices in wild places are often malevolent. Whether it's the laughter of a boggart in England, or the plaintive call of a woodwife in the Black Forest, folks knew to be wary. Even seemingly benign legends like the Swiss Barbagazi, fairy gnomes, include accounts of these creatures sending avalanches by imitating a skier's call. In many such stories, the deception is not intricate. It might just be an unexplained voice that leads someone off a safe path. But at times it becomes deeply personal, as with the Leshy or similar beings, directly using a familiar voice to betray. As we travel east across Eurasia, through the steppes and into the mountains of Central Asia, we find that the motif does not disappear. Nomadic folklore in regions like Siberia and Mongolia also speak of spirits of the land that echo human voices. For instance, some Siberian indigenous narratives mention forest spirits that repeat what you say in a distorted way, trying to lure you deeper. If you curse at them, they might leave you alone, interestingly. By the time we cross into East Asia, the belief in echo spirits and voice imitators takes on unique local flavors, which we will soon explore. But it's worth noting the continuity. From Europe into Asia, travelers' tales often come down to a simple truth. Not every voice is to be trusted. A traveler in the Carpathians or the Urals might echo that sentiment with one from the Alps or the Black Forest. The languages and names change, but the fear is recognizably the same. As we leave Europe, consider one more illustrative vignette from a 19th century folk tale in Eastern Europe. A small group of villagers were searching the woods at dusk for a lost child. Suddenly, they heard the child's voice crying, "Mama!" from far off among the trees. The mother, overjoyed, was about to run toward it, but the village elder grabbed her arm. He had noticed that the forest had gone deathly quiet. No birds, no normal echoes to the child's cry. Sensing a Leshy's trick, he ordered everyone to walk back to back, holding hands, and not to stray. They did, and as they left, the voice of the child shifted into strange laughter, echoing between the trunks. Later that night, they found the real child safe nearer the village. The voice in the woods had been a lure. This tale encapsulates the communal wisdom. Even in desperation, heed the context, not just the voice. If something felt off, the timing, the location, one must suspect a trickster spirit's mimicry. From the misty forests of Eurasia, the path now leads further east and south to cultures that had their own interpretations of echo and imitation. We shall see how in the lofty mountains of Japan and the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, similar stories emerged of voices that deceive. The particulars will differ, but listen closely, and that same ancient dread resounds. The false familiar is out there, calling your name. High in the secluded mountains of Japan, travelers often noticed a curious phenomenon. If they shouted a greeting or a yodel, the mountains would answer back a moment later with the same words. Today we know this simply as an echo, but to the Japanese of old, this delayed reply had a name and identity, Yamabiko, meaning mountain echo. The Yamabiko was envisioned as a small spirit, or yokai, that lives in the mountains and valleys, calling back any voice it hears. People believed that when you called out in the hills, it wasn't merely sound bouncing off rocks, it was a little creature answering you, playfully mimicking your voice. Far from malevolent, the Yamabiko was more a trickster or shy nature spirit. It was rarely seen. Toriyama Sekien's famous 18th century yokai bestiary depicts it as a small, furry, monkey-like being in one illustration, but its presence was heard in every echoing call. While the Yamabiko itself was not feared, indeed it was mostly a way to personify and explain echoes, it contributed to the tapestry of mimicry folklore by reinforcing the idea that the land itself can talk back in your own voice. Travelers were sometimes startled to hear what sounded like an unseen person repeating their words from the forest. Some local lore said that the Yamabiko could occasionally answer questions as an oracle, but more often it just mocked or repeated exactly what was said. In a sense, it was a benign cousin of the darker mimics elsewhere. However, even in Japan, not all echo voices were benign. There is a belief in some rural parts that at twilight, if you hear someone call your name from the woods and you cannot see them, you should not reply. This intersects with broader Japanese ghost lore. Spirits called yokai, or even ghosts of the dead, could hide in such voices. A well-known Japanese superstition warns against responding to one's name being called from nowhere at dusk, lest it be a ghost. Perhaps one of the reasons is the legend of ubume, ghosts of women who died in childbirth, sometimes calling out to passers-by to take their phantom baby, though that's more of a visual encounter. The yamabiko itself simply repeats any shout, but Japanese folklore also has the concept of yobuko, literally calling voice, which refers to mysterious voices in the wilderness. The term yobuko, call a child, is essentially another name for yamabiko in some regions, depicted as a spirit that mimics a traveler's shouts, or in some stories, a little ghost child whose cries echo in the hills. One lovely yet haunting image from a Japanese tale. A lone pilgrim in the mountains hears someone singing an old folk song from a distance. He sings the next line, and the unseen singer answers with the next. Back and forth, they trade verses across a valley, never seeing each other. At the end, the pilgrim calls, "Who are you?" The voice across the way simply sings back his question in the same melody, then fades into silence. The pilgrim continues on his way, heartened by the friendly duet, not realizing he likely spent the last half hour singing with a Yamabiko spirit, echoing his own voice back in playful harmony. It's a gentler take on the mimic, more an echo than a lure, showing that not all instances of this phenomenon in folklore were menacing. Sometimes they were merely mysterious or even comforting in their mirroring. In Chinese folklore, the idea of disembodied calling voices also appears, albeit often framed in terms of ghostly phenomena or cautionary superstition rather than named creatures. One Chinese folk belief holds that if you are walking at night and hear someone call your name, you must not answer on the first call. A common saying is that evil spirits, or gui, might call your name to get your attention, and acknowledging them makes you vulnerable to them. If you ignore it, they might leave you alone. This advice closely mirrors that of Europe and elsewhere, reflecting a near universal human anxiety. Chinese ghost lore has myriad spirits, but one interesting class are the yaoguai, and certain types of demons that can shapeshift or throw voices. There is a creature in medieval Chinese tales called the Wu Gui, beckoning ghost, that was said to lurk in forests calling people's names softly. Those who followed would become lost and never return. This is not among the most famous Chinese ghosts, but recorded in some provincial anecdotes. More commonly, the Chinese took echoes themselves to have spiritual cause. The term shan xiao refers to a type of mountain spirit or goblin. One source, the folklore compendium Su Shenji, describes a shang xiao that mimics the sounds of people in the wild to lead them astray. In fact, an old Chinese text notes the existence of certain echo apes, possibly gibbons, in the mountains whose calls can sound disturbingly human, which surely fed legends. Ancient authors like Ctesias and Pliny talked of Asian apes or birds able to repeat human speech. Chinese traditions likewise mention parrots or other creatures, but often with a supernatural twist. If a disembodied voice spoke in the forest, some might think it an animal mimicking. But why is that animal speaking? Possibly a transformed spirit. In Korea, a folktale figure known as the kokuri, or others might produce unexplained calls. Korean shamanism is replete with spirits of place. A lonely mountain spirit, Sansin, could test a traveler's will by calling out to them. One Korean cautionary tale tells of a man walking at night who hears his mother's voice calling him from behind. Remembering a superstition, he does not turn around. The voice calls again, angry now. He resists the urge and recites a prayer. Later, he finds out his mother was safe at home and had never been out. Thus, the thing behind him, whatever it was, eventually left when ignored. Some say it was a guishin, ghost, trying to trick him into looking, after which it could steal his soul. It's essentially the same template as the Chinese and Japanese advice. Don't respond or look when an unseen familiar voice calls, or you give it power. Throughout Southeast Asia, dense jungles and isolated mangrove swamps come with their own share of mimicry legends. The Malay and Indonesian folklore warns of the hantu and jinn, spirits often capable of illusions. One particularly frightening creature of the Malay world is the parakang, or in Filipino lore the aswang, which are ghoulish entities often described in more physical terms. However, some variants of these aswang, vampiric, shape-changing creatures, are said to use sound to deceive. A common tale in the Philippines is of the tianak, as we will discuss later, which lures by imitating a baby's cries. But beyond that, rural Filipinos and Malays have shared anecdotes of calling voices in the woods at night. In the Philippines, there's a practice. If you hear your name called in a lonely place, answer not yes, but rather respond by saying dili ko in some dialects, meaning I'm not the one, denying your identity. This is done to confuse the spirit or let it know you won't be fooled. Elsewhere, people will intentionally misidentify themselves if an unknown voice calls out, "That's not me," or "You have the wrong person," as a form of protective charm. These practices acknowledge the widespread belief in mimic ghosts, or Tagalog, mamboboses, voice mimickers. One especially spooky Filipino story recounts a man who was out late walking home when he heard his brother's voice calling him from a clump of trees, saying, "Come here." He was puzzled because he knew his brother was at home miles away. The voice was exactly identical, though. The man wisely refused to go into the trees and instead shouted back, "If you are really my brother, what is our mother's name?" There was a long silence, and then the only answer was a high-pitched giggle that warped into an animalistic cackle. The man ran and did not look back. The next day he learned no one from his family had been out there. He concluded it was a dewata, a trickster nature spirit, or an aswang trying to lure him. The giggle turned into a telltale sign that it wasn't human at all. Such stories abound around villages and are often shared to encourage children not to wander off, even if they think they hear a friend's voice calling. In the steaming forests of Thailand and Cambodia, similar beliefs exist. Thai folklore has the Phai Krasu and Phai Pop, ghostly entities which might not specifically mimic voices. They have other frightful traits. But Thai people also speak of Pret, ghosts of the restless dead, that sometimes call out the living person's name in passing. Fishermen in the Mekong Delta have whispered about hearing their wife's voice from across the water at night while they're alone, considered a bad omen or a water spirit's ploy. If they rowed toward it, some vanished in whirlpools. The vast Pacific, with its many islands, has its own haunting calls. On certain Pacific atolls, it is said that the spirits of departed ancestors sometimes roam the shoreline at night. For instance, in parts of Micronesia, there are stories that if a lone person is out on a lagoon in the dark, they might hear their name carried by the sea breeze. It could be an ancestor's spirit warning of an incoming storm, or a malevolent sea spirit trying to lure them overboard. The line between protective spirit and trickster gets blurred. In some Polynesian cultures, ancestral spirits, Aumakua in Hawaii for example, might call out to guide a relative to safety. Indeed, there's a modern account from Hawaii where a man lost in mountainous forest reported hearing his deceased grandfather's voice call his name, leading him back to the trail. He believed it was a guardian spirit. Yet at the same time, Hawaiian lore also contains the frightening night marches, ghostly processions of ancient warriors, which are heralded by chants and drums. If you hear their call, you're supposed to hide and never respond or look, for fear of death or being taken. While not a mimic of a familiar voice, it's another example of disembodied calls in the dark that one must not acknowledge. In some Melanesian tales, voices of the Masalai, bush spirits, can mimic clan members to test a hunter's courage. Aboriginal Australian lore, similarly, has many spirits of the land. One interesting figure is the Mimi of Arnhem Land. Not exactly a voice mimic, but very slender spirits said to live in rocks and echo sounds. When one calls out, it answers faintly. Aboriginal tales also often feature the rule, if you hear certain whistling or calling at night, do not whistle back. There is a well-known caution against whistling at night in many indigenous cultures of Australia and the Pacific, because it invites spirits. Some specifically say a spirit might be whistling at you, and if you answer it will come. From the lush forests of Asia to the remote islands of the Pacific, we see a tapestry of beliefs all reinforcing the core theme. The voice is a powerful tool of the unseen. Whether taking the guise of a helpful echo spirit like Japan's Yamabiko, or the dangerous lures of jungle demons, the voice, unmoored from a visible source, unsettles us across every culture. It is notable that even where these phenomena are not cast as explicitly evil, they remain uncanny. A Yamabiko's mimicry might make one chuckle or marvel, but it still reminds that a spirit resides, copying your words. In many other cases, of course, the intention is malevolent, to deceive and harm. As we prepare to cross into the new world, think of the through line from Europe, through Asia, and now beyond. Travelers and lonely people in all these places learn to be wary of disembodied voices. A Chinese grandparent telling a child, "Don't answer if someone invisible calls you at night," would find agreement from a Maori elder, giving the same advice across the ocean. Now, we will see how the Americas and Africa likewise inherited or developed their own versions of these mimicry fears. The settings change: dense American woodlands, arid plains, tropical savannas, but the voices in the dark continue their unsettling chorus as humanity listens with ancient, anxious ears. The indigenous peoples of North America have rich oral traditions, and among them are numerous cautionary tales of trickster spirits that imitate voices across lonely places. In the lore of many First Nations and Native American tribes, one finds references to beings that call out in the wilderness to lure victims. For example, various tribes of the Pacific Northwest speak of the Stick Indians, mysterious, possibly supernatural wild men of the woods. Accounts of Stick Indians often emphasize their eerie vocal tricks. They whistle, laugh, or even call a person's name in voices that sound almost human but not quite. These entities are considered dangerous. They play pranks that can turn lethal, like leading people astray at night. The Spokane, Salish, and other plateau tribes have stories of hunters hearing voices of family members calling them deeper into the timber, only to realize too late it was a Stick Indian mimicking someone familiar to lure them. One such story tells of a young man who heard his brother's voice say, "Come here, I found something," from up a hillside. As he climbed in that direction, the voice kept beckoning further on. Eventually, the young man snapped out of a kind of daze to find himself on the edge of a treacherous ravine. No brother in sight. He'd been following a spirit's call. He managed to scramble back and survive, attributing his escape to remembering a traditional warning that forest spirits can throw voices like a ventriloquist. Meanwhile, the Great Plains and woodlands have their own tales. The Navajo and some related peoples have the infamous legend of the Skinwalker, essentially a malevolent witch that can shape-shift into animal forms. In recent years, skinwalkers have become an internet and pop culture phenomenon, with many alleged modern encounters. A recurring element of these modern accounts is that skinwalkers can mimic human voices, calling out in the voice of a relative or friend to lure people out of their homes at night. While some debate exists whether this aspect was present in original Navajo lore or if it's a contemporary addition, many Navajo people today do indeed caution that a skinwalker may use familiar cries to deceive. One chilling story from the Four Corners region describes a family at night hearing the voice of their grandmother, who was deceased, outside the hogan, begging to be let in. The voice was anguished and unmistakable. The family, though terrified, did not open the door. They performed a protective chant until the dawn. In the morning, they found coyote tracks around the dwelling. This was interpreted as a skinwalker taking the shape of a coyote, but using the grandmother's voice to try to trick them. In Navajo belief, a skinwalker is essentially a demon in human disguise, so mimicking a loved one's voice is not beyond its cunning. It is exactly the kind of spiritual violation it would commit. Similarly, among Algonquian-speaking peoples in the north, Cree, Ojibwe, etc., the dreaded Wendigo is a spirit of winter and starvation, often associated with cannibalism. Traditional Wendigo stories emphasize its gaunt appearance and hunger, but some versions indeed claim a Wendigo can call out in the voice of its previous human victim, or in the voice of someone the victim knows, to draw new prey. For instance, a Cree tale from James Bay tells of a Wendigo that lurked in the woods near a settlement. Villagers would hear a friend calling for help in the forest, only to realize that friend had gone missing days before. It was the Wendigo using their voice like a fisher uses a lure. Even outside specific monster lore, many Native American groups share a general guideline. If your name is carried on the wind with no one visible, do not answer. The Cherokee speak of Uktana, a mythic serpent, and other spirits that can project sounds. Southeastern tribes have the story of the Wog, or whooping spirit, a booger, bogeyman, that whoops or calls in the night to confuse you. Additionally, in Appalachian folklore, which is a blend of European settler and indigenous influence, one finds countless ghost tales of voices calling from the woods or hollows. For example, Appalachian granny witch wisdom often held that if you hear your mother calling you from outside at dusk, and you know your mother is actually in the house or nowhere nearby, then it's not really your mother. It's a haint ghost or spirit mimicking her. Many older Appalachian folks would simply say, "Don't go running when you hear your name out yonder. Make sure who's calling." This is strikingly similar to the Chinese and Filipino admonitions we've seen, indicating that independent of direct cultural connection, human experiences produce the same caution. Traveling to South America, we meet one of the most famous characters of Brazilian folklore, the Curupira, often depicted as a small, mischievous guardian of the rainforest, with flaming red or orange hair and feet turned backwards. The Curupira's mission is to protect the forest and its animals from harm, especially from hunters and woodcutters who take more than they need. To achieve this, the Curupira employs a host of tricks. One of its signature tricks is mimicking the human voice and other sounds to lead trespassers astray. Many a hunter's story in Brazil, dating back to the days of Portuguese colonists and likely drawing on indigenous Tupi-Guarani beliefs, tells of the Curupira imitating the shouts of a hunter's companion or the cries of a person in distress, luring the hunter deep into the tangled woods until he becomes hopelessly lost. The Curupira, they say, can even mimic a child's pleading cries or a woman's laughter, any sound to entice the unwary. Once the person is far from the trail, the Curupira may vanish with a cackle, leaving the victim panicked and disoriented. The backward-facing feet play into this as well. If one tries to track the Curupira's footprints, they will actually be led in the opposite direction. Direction intended, due to the reverse tracks. One 19th century account by a European traveler in Amazonia recounts local guides absolutely swearing that a certain eerie whistle in the jungle was the Curupira. They refused to follow it, explaining that the Curupira would whistle or call one's name exactly like a fellow tribesman, and the moment you answered or pursued, you were doomed to wander in circles. Some say it can bind a spell of confusion on you. You'll walk in endless loops hearing phantom noises until perhaps you collapse. The guides took the phenomenon so seriously that they carried fumo, tobacco, as an offering, a known appeasement for it, and if they suspected it was near, they'd leave some tobacco on a tree stump and mutter respectful words, rather than chasing the suspicious voice. Another trick of this forest guardian, it is said to produce a high-pitched whistle or scream that imitates a human voice to startle intruders. Some legends state that this being's call could even entrance a person, effectively hypnotizing them to follow the sound deeper into the forest. In this, the guardian echoes the global pattern, use of beloved or attention-grabbing sounds to deceive. A recorded folklore piece describes an encounter. A woodcutter heard his daughter's voice calling him by name in the forest at dawn. Knowing his daughter should be home in the village, he immediately grew suspicious. When the voice persisted, sounding urgent, the woodcutter cleverly responded, "I'm coming." But he did not move toward it. Instead, he quietly climbed a tree. From that vantage, he claims to have seen a small red-haired figure below, calling out while looking around, perhaps confused why the woodcutter hadn't rushed over yet. After a while, the entity faded back into the foliage, laughing oddly. The woodcutter thanked his forest spirits for the wisdom not to be fooled and descended once it was safe. The lesson spread. This guardian can imitate even your kin's voices, so always think twice in the jungle. Indeed, a scholarly entry notes, with the intention of attracting his victims, this protector calls hunters with screams that imitate the human voice. Through high-pitched sounds and whistles, he tortures those who dare harm the forest. It is interesting that in Brazilian culture today, this figure is often taught to children almost like a fairy tale. They might find him fascinating rather than purely terrifying. Yet beneath the fun image, the root is frightening, a hidden presence that can copy your voice, your loved ones' voices, and use your trust in them to punish you. Brazilian lore has a few similar beings like the Sachi, a one-legged imp, known more for whirling winds than voice mimicry, but often conflated with this guardian in popular telling. However, the concept of encantados, enchanted ones, often dolphins or snakes that can become human, also includes voice tricks. For instance, Amazon River dolphin Encantados supposedly can speak with human voices when in humanoid form, seducing people. Not quite mimicry of a specific person, but relevant to the theme of deceptive voices. Even the wind in some Andean tales is personified. Quechua stories sometimes talk of wayward voices on mountain passes, blamed on apus or mountain spirits. The continent of Africa, with its vast array of cultures, also carries stories of voices in the shadows. Though African folklore is enormously diverse, there are some common threads. Many African traditional beliefs involve ancestor spirits or nature spirits communicating with the living. Sometimes this can take the form of a disembodied voice. In West African, for example Yoruba or Igbo lore, it's not unusual to hear of a forest being, perhaps a trickster or a malevolent genie-like spirit calling someone's name. The Yoruba have stories about trickster spirits of the wild called ajogun that might mimic voices to lure people off paths. While specific names and details vary, a general wariness exists of responding to unknown calls. Across the savannas of East Africa, one finds the concept of ghost lights or voices at night, akin to global will-o'-the-wisp legends. Among the Swahili of coastal East Africa, there's the belief in jinns, borrowed from Islamic lore, who can shape-shift and also throw voices. In fact, some Swahili tales mention a particular evil jinn that calls out to you in the voice of someone you know, often trying to lead you into the wilderness or to a gravesite. If one responds or follows, the jinn can then possess or harm them. Ethnographic notes from Sudan in the early 20th century recorded villagers warning each other about the Zar spirits imitating relatives' voices at night, part of the Zar cult beliefs which revolve around possessing spirits. A compelling African example comes from the Ashanti, Ghana. The folklore figure Onini, a python spirit, sometimes is said to call people by name to draw them toward rivers, where the python might drown them. More concrete is the southern African belief in the Tikoloshe, a small goblin in Zulu and Xhosa mythology. The Tokoloshi is more known for invisibility and causing illness, but some stories attribute voice mimicry to it. There's a modern tale from a South African farm where a man heard his friend shouting for help from a well. When he approached, nobody was there. Locals later suggested it was the Tokoloshi trying to lure him to fall in. Similarly, across much of Africa, it's believed that witchcraft can involve throwing one's voice or making others hear things. So sometimes a disembodied familiar voice is interpreted as a witch's trick. North Africa and the Middle East share the jinn folklore, where jinn are explicitly noted to imitate voices of loved ones as a test or torment. For instance, one Moroccan story tells of a jinn in the desert that calls travelers by name in the voice of their spouse, trying to draw them off route, perhaps into an ambush, or simply to amuse itself with their confusion. African diasporic folklore in the Caribbean also retains this theme. In Jamaican and Haitian lore, duppies, ghosts, or aloha, spirits, can call out in the voices of the living or recently deceased, either to tempt or to warn. Some Haitian tales interpret a familiar voice in an odd place as possibly a spirit, manifesting to give counsel, others as a deceitful baka, evil spirit, hoping to mislead. One chilling anecdote from Kenya. In one community, it was reported in the 1980s that children on their way home from school would hear their mother or father calling them from a thicket in an unmistakable voice. If a child went into the thicket, they sometimes disappeared. Likely a cautionary story to keep kids from straying, but it was explained as a known spirit in that region doing it. Eventually, parents instructed their children to always come straight home and ignore any side of road callings, because the forest demon calls in our voices. This exactly parallels that earlier Chinese story from Hainan we saw, where grandparents warned kids about voices at the nighttime outhouse. We have now spanned the globe in our survey of folklore, and it is clear that the motif of mimicry, of something that sounds like us but isn't one of us, is virtually universal. In wilderness settings especially, where isolation and the unknown amplify fear, cultures populated the darkness with entities that exploit the human voice. Across Europe and Asia, we saw echo spirits and deceptive forest dwellers. In the Americas and Africa, we see trickster demons and protective guardians using the same method. There are variations, of course. In some traditions, the mimicking voice might occasionally be benevolent, like an ancestor trying to guide someone lost, but far more often it is treacherous. The lesson hammered into listeners through generations of storytelling is remarkably consistent. Never automatically trust a voice out of place, even if it wears a familiar tone. Certain environments breed certain stories. Deep forests, Amazon, European woodlands, North American forests, gave us the Leshy, Kurupira, Stick Indians, all quite analogous in role as forest guardians/tricksters that mislead exploiters with voice mimicry. Mountainous echo regions, Japan's mountains, Europe's Alps, parts of Africa and Americas, gave us echo spirits often explained as ghosts or yokai, Yamabiko, etc. Deserts and open plains, interestingly, these often highlight demons or jinn using mirage tactics, including voices, since in an open landscape, hearing a voice with no source can be even eerier. And in tropical or island locales, we encounter watery voice lure legends, sirens at sea, or the Polynesian ghost calling from the shore. By now, you might be marveling that so many far-flung cultures independently came to spin such similar tales. Is it that the phenomenon of hearing phantom voices is a common human experience with natural causes, echoes, animals, the brain's tricks, that got mythologized differently by each culture? Or do these stories tap into a deeper, almost Jungian, archetype, the false familiar, the deceiver, which is a fundamental human fear, thus inevitably expressed in lore worldwide? Perhaps both. There is no doubt that people everywhere sometimes think they hear their name when no one called it. A mild auditory hallucination not uncommon, or an interpretation of a random sound. The brain is tuned to pick out the pattern of our name. We've even seen that modern surveys suggest up to 75% of people have experienced something like hearing their name called when alone. Without science, our ancestors naturally wove supernatural explanations around these unsettling moments. Yet, the cultural specifics, from the Leshy's backward foot to the Kurupira's flaming hair to the Skinwalker's shape-shifting, are vivid and unique. What remains constant is the emotional core, the betrayal of trust, the collapse of reality's reliability. When a voice you find safe and beloved manifests where it logically shouldn't, it is a primal terror which folklore has managed and mediated by telling stories that double as warnings. So whether it's a grandmother in Appalachia saying, "If you hear mama calling you and she ain't there, don't answer, honey," or an old Chinese fisherman saying, "Don't turn your head when the ghost calls your soul," the advice aligns across continents. And if people separated by oceans and millennia concur on a piece of supernatural wisdom, one feels there must be some potent truth in it, if not literally, then psychologically. As we transition into more modern times, keep these folklore foundations in mind. The motif of mimicry did not die with the old beliefs. It carried forward, evolving into ghost stories of the 19th and 20th centuries, recorded hauntings, and even contemporary paranormal encounters. We will soon see how the coming of science and technology did not silence these voices. Indeed, even today, people report experiencing that same age-old dread, hearing a loved one call out when that loved one isn't there. Folklore prepared us to fear it. Now modern accounts will show it in a new and often frighteningly personal light. By the 19th century, the world was changing rapidly. The Industrial Revolution, urbanization, and the spread of scientific thought began to reshape how people perceive mysteries. Folklore didn't vanish, far from it, but the manner of documenting and discussing unexplained phenomena shifted. We start to see written records, newspaper articles, and journals describing uncanny experiences with voices in context not solely relegated to fairy tales. In this era, the line between folklore and report became intriguingly blurred as educated people also encountered, or at least took interest in such eerie events. And some of the most famous hauntings on record occurred in the 1800s and early 1900s, carrying clear elements of voice mimicry and disembodied vocal phenomena. Let us examine a few notable instances from the 19th and 20th centuries where witness testimony brings the old motif of the false familiar into a more contemporary focus. Perhaps the most famous voice mimic haunting of the 19th century was the Bell Witch of Tennessee. Witnesses said the invisible presence could speak in many voices, sometimes even imitating members of the Bell family themselves. We'll return to that haunting later in full, because it stands as the clearest bridge between old folklore's whispering spirits and the modern talking poltergeist. The Bell Witch may be most famous, but it wasn't alone. The 19th century press recorded numerous hauntings with disembodied voices. In the 1870s in Amherst, Nova Scotia, for example, the Great Amherst Mystery centered on a young woman, Esther Cox, tormented by a poltergeist. Alongside loud knockings and moving objects, there were voices heard. One witness described a gruff, disembodied voice threatening Esther. While not explicitly stated to mimic a familiar person, it was a voice manifesting from nowhere. In early 20th century England, the Borley Rectory case, often called the most haunted house in England, events spanning 1920s to 1930s, included numerous auditory phenomena, footsteps, whispers, and even one instance of a ghostly voice calling out the name Marianne, believed to be addressing the rector's wife. Visitors in Borley Rectory sometimes reported hearing their own names softly spoken from an empty corridor. One account from 1931 mentions a reporter hearing someone call Edward behind him, though no one else was present, an unnerving personal touch by whatever haunted Borley. This wasn't a trick to lure, since he didn't run off, but more a chilling acknowledgement. The unseen presence knew him, knew his name. That simple act, a ghost saying your name, profoundly frightens, as it collapses the comforting idea that you might be anonymous or safe from it. In 1930's Isle of Man, a bizarre case emerged of Geff the Talking Mongoose. Though it sounds like pure whimsy, the case was documented by investigators. A family claimed a small, unseen animal, which occasionally showed itself as a mongoose-like creature, lived in their farm walls and spoke to them. Geff, as it called itself, had a high-pitched voice, but interestingly could imitate others. It reportedly would mimic the voice of the family members when they were away, for instance calling the father's name in the daughter's voice to get him to come, or vice versa. Geff's existence was never conclusively proven. Some suspect ventriloquism or teenage pranks, but many who studied it were struck by how it mirrored poltergeist traits, only in the form of an animal spirit. One thing noted is that Geff started by mimicking sounds, animal noises, a baby's cry, then progressed to actual human speech. In one report, early on it repeated the family's own words like a parrot from within the walls, almost like it was learning to talk by mimicry. Before long, it was carrying on conversations and, yes, singing and swearing with multiple voices. Some researchers at the time likened it to the Bell Witch in miniature. True or hoax, the story of Geff shows how even in the 1930s the fascination and fear of a disembodied voice duplicating human sounds was still potent. The family described Geff sometimes talking to itself in different voices, one high, one low, as if impersonating two people having a conversation. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, as exploration of remote areas peaked, there came reports from explorers of what we might call mimicry in the wild from a psychological angle. A famous example often cited in psychology and mountaineering literature is the third man factor, the sensed presence of an unseen companion during extreme stress or isolation. Sir Ernest Shackleton, the Antarctic explorer, wrote of how during his harrowing trek on South Georgia Island in 1916, he and his two companions all felt there was an extra, unseen member of their party. They even heard a voice guiding or encouraging them at times. Shackleton described hearing a comforting voice among them that was not any of the three men's. This wasn't a trickster voice luring him to peril. Rather, it seemed protective, like a guardian angel. But it shows the flip side. Our minds under duress can project voices of absent loved ones or beings to cope. There are mountaineers who've heard the voices of their wives or friends giving instruction when they were on the brink of collapse. One could frame these as miracles, hallucinations, or something mystical, yet they are deeply real to those who experience them. Some survivors of shipwrecks or desert ordeals similarly recounted hearing a familiar voice that gave them hope or clear directions. Interestingly, folklore might interpret those as ancestors or spirits intervening kindly. In a sense, these are positive instances of mimicry. The voice of someone known coming unbidden to one's rescue may be truly from beyond or from the depths of one's psyche. It is still profoundly uncanny. Imagine hearing your sister's voice clearly telling you which way to go to find help, when you know she's 1,000 miles away. You might later rationalize it, but in the moment it feels like a supernatural guiding call. On the flip side, there are expedition notes about hearing one's name out in the wilderness with no explicable source, which brought dread. An Arctic explorer in the 1850s, Dr. Elisha Kane, wrote in his diary of hearing his own surname shouted on the wind during a polar night. He regarded it as the hallucination of an exhausted mind, yet he admitted it made his blood run cold. American frontiersmen and trappers in the 19th century carried the folklore of voices in the wild with them. For instance, some wrote of Native American guides warning them about voices of the trickster spirits in certain valleys. So again, the folklore kept them vigilant, although one could argue environmental sounds, echo animals, were behind it. By the early to mid-20th century, in the era of spiritualism and ghost clubs, numerous hauntings were documented, where the ghost didn't just knock, but spoke. In Britain, aside from Borley, we have cases like the Enfield poltergeist of 1977, famous for the unsettling voice that apparently spoke through an 11-year-old girl in a guttural tone. That wasn't a disembodied mimic voice exactly. It was the girl allegedly possessed speaking as an old man's ghost, but it was a phenomenon of a voice where it shouldn't be. In that case, the wrong voice coming from a young girl's body, like acoustic mimicry in a sense. The Enfield entity would at times also bark like a dog and mimic the researchers' own voices in a taunting way, according to reports by Ed and Lorraine Warren, who visited. These features show a through line. Whatever poltergeists are, they delight in mimicking and absurdly imitating to confuse and scare. If we look at ghost reports compiled through the 20th century, a recurrent minor motif appears. Someone home alone hears a family member call them, only to later confirm that family member was neither home nor had called. This sort of anecdote pops up in true ghost story collections. For example, a woman in 1950s London might report that she distinctly heard her husband shout her name from downstairs. Thinking he'd returned from work, she went down only to find no one. Then moments later the phone rings, and it's news of an accident involving her husband, cue ominous connection, as if a crisis triggered a telepathic or ghostly voice event. Many people quietly share such stories among friends. The other day I heard you calling me. I swear I did, but you were out. Wasn't that odd? The glitch in the matrix quality of these events continues to puzzle. Sometimes they're tied to death. There's an old belief in Britain called the voice of death, or death summons, that hearing a loved one call you when they are not present can portend their death, essentially a vocal form of an omen. A documented case on the day of the Battle of Dunbar, 1650. The mother of a Scottish soldier at home claimed she heard her son's voice call out to her thrice in the night. She later learned he'd died around that time in battle. Such stories persisted into the world wars, families hearing the voices of sons or husbands at the approximate hour of their fall on distant battlefields as if a final farewell echo. Investigators like the Society for Psychical Research collected many such anecdotes. They called them auditory hallucinations, possibly generated by crisis telepathy, essentially a scientific attempt at what folklore simply accepted as a ghostly sign. Regardless of interpretation, the pattern is recognizably that ancient one, a familiar voice appearing unnaturally, outside its proper context, carrying a weight of dread or sorrow. Here are several concrete, documented examples from the 19th and 20th centuries that include witness testimony of voice mimicry. The first is the Bell Witch haunting in Tennessee around 1820. Witnesses such as John Johnston and an English visitor gave sworn testimony describing how the entity perfectly reproduced the voices of known individuals. The Englishman even wrote a letter to the Bell family, later cited in Ingram's account, apologizing for his skepticism and noting that the spirit did speak in my father's voice, though he be across the sea. Neighbors under oath confirmed hearing the witch recite their own sermons word for word. These records stand as some of the earliest credible attestations of disembodied voice mimicry. A second case appeared in an obscure 19th century magazine, the Cape Matanuska Incident in Alaska, 1889. A prospector spending the winter alone began to hear his dead partner calling him from outside the cabin at dusk. The voice alternated between desperate pleas and unsettling laughter. In a letter later printed in the Journal of American Folklore, 1890, the man wrote that he knew his companion was gone, Yet damned if I didn't hear him whispering and hollering after he was buried. Remembering native warnings about forest devils that mimic the dead, he refused to step outside and survive by ignoring the voice. His correspondence to the folklorist provides a rare first-hand document, linking local indigenous belief with a modern testimony. Next came the Amherst poltergeist of Nova Scotia in 1878. Investigator Walter Hubble collected detailed statements from witnesses who heard a disembodied voice addressing the young woman Esther Cox, threatening to burn the house. Esther's brother-in-law William Cox signed an affidavit declaring, "I have with my own ears heard voices proceeding from no visible source in broad daylight in Esther's presence, which said they would set fire to the house and kill us all." The voice in this case did not imitate a loved one, but was clearly conversational, an unseen speaker interacting directly with the living. Another lesser-known haunting surfaced in Ohio in 1884, the McConnellsville case, recorded in the Proceedings of the American Society for Psychical Research. Investigators documented a widower who repeatedly heard his late wife's voice at night, softly calling their children by name. On several occasions, her familiar lullaby floated through an empty room, and visiting neighbors attested to hearing it themselves. These first-hand accounts, preserved in the SPR archives, show mimicry used not to terrify or deceive, but seemingly to comfort, leading many to interpret the phenomenon as the genuine spirit of the wife rather than an impostor. Finally, in 20th century England came the famous Enfield poltergeist of 1977. Multiple witnesses, including police officers, reporters, and researchers, heard a coarse male voice that identified itself as a ghost named Bill, speaking through 11-year-old Janet Hodgson. Parapsychologist Maurice Gross recorded hours of these sessions. At times, the voice mocked the investigators by imitating their own accents and even repeating Gross's occasional expletives back at him. These recordings still exist today, preserving an eerie moment when a child's throat produced the overlapping tones of adults and strangers. Together, these cases, from the Bellwitch farmhouse to a London council house, span a century and a half of documentation, each offering witnesses who swore they had heard a voice that sounded perfectly familiar, yet came from nowhere at all. If we take the previous famous cases together, Bellwitch, Amherst, Borley, Enfield, etc., a theme emerges. Many poltergeist-type hauntings begin with knocks and move to voices, and often those voices prove adept at mimicry. The Bellwitch and Enfield cases especially illustrate the frightening potential of a mimic spirit. It wields our own voices and those of our kin like weapons or toys. This is, psychologically, one of the deepest violations one can feel. There are transcripts from the Enfield tapes where the ghost voice, using an old man persona, imitates a barking dog and then laughs that it fooled them, clearly reveling in mimicry to scare. Likewise, the Bell Witch would mimic two people arguing down the road, leading listeners to think neighbors were approaching. Then it would laugh at the joke played. These historical accounts with multiple witnesses have essentially given a modern, documented dimension to what used to be whispered folklore. They suggest that if something paranormal does exist, it seems to have a propensity for mimicry across centuries. In some, the 19th and 20th centuries did not dispel the old mimic voice phenomenon. They simply moved it into new settings, drawing rooms, rectories, farmhouses, and placed it under investigators' gaze. And the investigators, to their surprise or frustration, often found themselves played with by these very voices. Skeptical or not, how does one react when a disembodied entity suddenly calls out one's own name in the dark of a seance room? For many, it was life-changing, either in belief or trauma. As we proceed to the present day, it's worth noting that technology and modern media have only spread these stories further. The late 20th century brought paranormal encounters into pop culture, and alongside UFOs and cryptids, the motif of the mimic has grown perhaps even more prevalent via the internet. Next, we will explore contemporary reports and investigations, including those aided by modern recording devices, which continue to capture these most unsettling of voices that sound like us, but are not us. In the 21st century, humanity lives surrounded by technology, skepticism, and scientific explanations, and yet the age-old fear of the false familiar voice remains alive and well. If anything, the advent of the internet has allowed thousands of stories to surface, shared on forums and social media, of people who have experienced this phenomenon firsthand. Unlike our ancestors, modern people often have the means to attempt documentation. Audio recorders, video cameras, phone apps. Ghost hunting has become a hobby and even a profession for some. Consequently, we have a wealth of contemporary anecdotes, EVP recordings, and investigation logs that echo the patterns we've traced throughout history. Let's delve into some of these modern accounts and how they've been approached. On platforms like Reddit, personal paranormal encounter threads abound, and one recurring theme is what users commonly call a mimic. Particularly in communities like r/paranormal or r/no sleep, for fictionalized horror, one sees many posts along the lines of, "I heard my mum call my name, but she wasn't home. What was it?" The collective narrative that's emerged online draws from both folklore and popular culture. Many posters from rural or indigenous backgrounds will explicitly reference their culture's cautionary tales. One might say, "I grew up hearing elders warn about stick Indians or skinwalkers mimicking voices. Last night I experienced it." For example, a Reddit user in 2019 shared a story from the Navajo reservation. He and his cousin heard the voice of their grandmother calling them from a cornfield at dusk. They knew the real grandmother was inside cooking, so they exchanged fearful glances and didn't respond. The voice called again, more insistently, using a pet name only the grandmother would use. The boys, recalling stories of skinwalkers, ran back to the house. The post noted that their grandmother later told them she'd heard someone knocking on the wall and imitating her own voice softly, a sign she believed that a skinwalker was attempting to draw the children out. This story, presented in a casual online format, nonetheless closely mirrors accounts given to anthropologists a century prior, a continuity of mimic folklore carried into the digital age. Another example from a widely upvoted post: a young woman working late in an office building heard her father call her nickname from down the empty hall. She almost answered, then remembered her father was across the country. She described an overwhelming sense of dread and left immediately. She asked the forum if anyone had similar experiences. Dozens replied with their own, "I heard my friend's voice when alone at home" stories, often concluding with the consensus advice, "Do not acknowledge it." It's fascinating. A kind of global hive mind folklore has formed online, where people from different backgrounds reinforce the same warning. One highly rated comment on that thread referenced Chinese beliefs. "This is what we call a ghost calling your soul. My mother always said never respond to your name if you're unsure who calls." Another person responded with Appalachian law. "Yep, we say if you answer, you're inviting death." And so on. In effect, the internet has created a space where fragmented pieces of mimicry folklore from around the world are corroborating each other, convincing many that this phenomenon is real and dangerous. It has also spawned new urban legends. The concept of the skinwalker, originally specific to Navajo witch legend, has in internet horror circles generalized to mean any unknown humanoid entity that mimics voices to lure prey. Countless skinwalker sighting stories, often likely fiction or mistaken identity, involve someone in the woods hearing their friend or family member call for help, but something feels off. In the story, it's revealed the real friend was nowhere near, or the voice had an uncanny quality, and sometimes the protagonist then sees a creature peering from the trees, often described as a gaunt, maybe deer-like figure that can scream like a person. This image has so permeated pop culture that on TikTok and YouTube, one finds compilations titled "Mimics and Voice-Stealing Entities Caught on Camera," often pairing spooky audio, like a mountain lion's cry, which sounds eerily like a woman's scream, with captions suggesting a monster. It's important to note that along with genuine anecdotes, the market for entertainment has produced dramatizations. But behind the exaggeration lies true recorded cases. Across recent years, countless people have come forward with stories of hearing the voices of those they love when they were certain they were alone. These aren't tales from centuries ago, whispered around campfires, but modern accounts shared with investigators, podcasts, and online communities, each echoing the same ancient unease, the familiar sound of a loved one's voice heard in an impossible place. One report came from Texas in 2015. A man was sitting quietly in his living room when he heard his wife call from the kitchen, her tone casual and unmistakable. "Honey, can you help me?" He assumed she had returned from the grocery store and went to lend a hand. But when he stepped into the kitchen, the room was empty. Moments later, his phone rang. It was his wife still at the store, asking for help carrying bags to the car. The man stood frozen, trying to process what had happened. In his account of phantoms and monsters, he explained that nothing like it had ever happened before or since. The researcher who documented the case found no history of hauntings or paranormal activity in the home. It seemed to be an isolated moment, a single glitch in the ordinary, a voice that sounded entirely real and entirely misplaced. A second story emerged in 2020 from a police officer who spoke anonymously on a paranormal podcast. While on night patrol near a forested park, he responded to a routine call and began checking the trail on foot. As he walked deeper into the woods, he heard his partner's voice, clear, urgent, and low, whisper, "Over here, quick." Without hesitation, he turned toward the sound and jogged into the brush. His flashlight beam swung across empty trees. There was no one. He called his partner on the radio. The man replied from the patrol car, saying he hadn't moved or spoken at all. The officer later admitted he wasn't superstitious, not one to believe in ghost crap, as he put it. Yet the encounter shook him. Something had led him off the path that night, and he couldn't decide what was worse, the thought of someone hiding in the woods, or the thought that there hadn't been anyone there at all. It's a modern uniformed version of a story as old as time, a lone figure hearing a trusted voice calling from the dark. Another account surfaced online in 2018, this time from a young mother. She described hearing her small son call out, "Mommy," from outside the house at dusk. The sound was so distinct and immediate that she hurried to the door, thinking he'd slipped out. But when she checked his room, he was still fast asleep in bed. The yard was empty. Disturbed, she told her own mother what had happened. Her family was Vietnamese, and her mother recognized the pattern at once, warning that it might be the work of a ma quai, a ghost imitating a familiar voice to lure someone outside. Following her mother's advice, they burned joss paper and performed a brief cleansing ritual, speaking aloud and telling the spirit to leave. Afterward, the phantom call never returned. The woman ended her post reflecting that her mother's explanation, whether supernatural or psychological, had brought her peace. Each of these modern testimonies carries the same rhythm of shock and disquiet, an ordinary moment interrupted by a voice that should have signaled comfort, but instead summoned fear. The settings change: a suburban living room, a police patrol in the woods, a quiet home at dusk, but the sensation remains identical. Something called to them in a voice they knew by heart, and each was left to wonder, what if the sound of love itself could sometimes be a trap? These personal accounts often don't make headlines, but they are the bread and butter of modern paranormal reportage. Ordinary people encountering something that ancient folklore would recognize instantly. The difference is now they can share it widely, and perhaps find others with the same experience, lending a kind of collective validation that this really happens. A controversial area where mimicry law meets real-life mystery is in cases of unexplained disappearances in wild areas. Author and researcher David Paulides, known for his Missing 411 books, has catalogued many bizarre missing person cases in U.S. national parks. In a few of these, survivors or nearby hikers report odd phenomena. One recurring detail: children who went missing and were found alive sometimes tell strange stories. Paulides recounts a case of a toddler who vanished in the woods for 2 days in the 2000s. When found, the child said the big grandma had taken care of him. A grandma that looked like his own but wasn't her, and who had a scratchy voice. This child's testimony is vague, but one could postulate a mimic in action, some entity that took on a familiar countenance and voice. Another example: a boy in Yosemite went missing and later said he followed what he thought was his friend's voice calling him up a mountainside, but ended up lost. This is mentioned on a Missing 411 forum discussion, presumably from one of Paulides' interviews. These eerie anecdotes are not verifiable in the sense of hard evidence, but they match the folklore of trickster spirits luring victims, raising the hair-tingling question: could some modern disappearances in the wilderness be due not to misadventure or animal attacks alone, but to that same old unknown that's haunted humanity? Of course, skeptics may counter that these are just embellishments or the misperceptions of a frightened child, but it is noteworthy how the descriptions, a grandma figure, a voice of a friend, align with the mimic template. Since the mid-20th century, paranormal investigators have used audio recorders extensively to capture EVPs, Among these EVPs are some that suggest voice mimicry. One famous case, in 1984, the San Pedro haunting, California, involved a woman named Jackie Hernandez, plagued by a violent poltergeist. Investigators Barry Taff and others recorded various EVPs in her attic. In one chilling tape, later aired on TV's Unsolved Mysteries, you can hear what sounds like a child's voice softly pleading "Mama," and then an adult male voice angrily shouting Jackie's name. Jackie confirmed the male voice sounded like her deceased ex-husband, who had been abusive. That case had a lot of phenomena, even a photographer nearly asphyxiated by unexplained hanging. But the voice recordings stand out. If genuine, they represent a ghost utilizing familiar voices to emotionally batter the victim. The childlike mama, presumably to distress her, and the ex-husband's tone to taunt. This was all captured on 1980s audio tech, adding a measure of credibility beyond just personal ear witness. The haunting of San Pedro is a case I've covered in much detail here on the channel. In more controlled conditions, some ghost hunting groups have reported instances where entities seem to call investigators by name, a direct parallel to Folklore's personal lure. For instance, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum ghost tours have multiple EVP clips where a voice clearly whispers tour guides' names into the recorder when they were not speaking. One guide reported an incident in 2019. She was leading a group when through her walkie-talkie, a voice that sounded like her colleague said, "Stop a second." She stopped only to find out her colleague hadn't radioed at all. Whether a technical glitch or a prank or truly something paranormal, such things convince many investigators that spirits not only can talk, but specifically assume identities. In Ghost Adventures, the TV show, there's an episode at a Nevada mining town where the crew claimed a spirit mimicked the show's host Zach's voice. They heard Zach's distinctive tone say, "Hey guys," from an empty mine, when Zach himself was elsewhere. They dramatically interpreted it as a malicious entity, and indeed on review of the audio, it did sound eerily like Zach. Cases like these, presented in media, blur the line between evidence and entertainment, but they propagate the idea that mimic entities are a known category. In fact, some paranormal investigators now casually classify certain hauntings as mimic cases, meaning a case where the ghost repeatedly impersonates specific people. It's become a part of the ghost hunter lingo. One fascinating piece of audio came from a 2012 investigation by the Atlantic Paranormal Society, TAPS, at a historic home in New England. They set up a recorder in an empty hallway and captured what sounded like a little girl calling the homeowner's name, Anna, twice, very clearly, when no females, only male investigators were on site. This EVP was played on the radio show Coast to Coast AM. Experts ruled out radio interference. Anna, the homeowner, affirmed it was a little girl's voice she didn't recognize, and she had no children. The speculation was maybe a child's spirit was calling out to Anna for motherly attention. Again, if one strips away the context, it's a disembodied voice using the target's name to get a response. When all of these modern encounters are set side by side, clear patterns begin to surface, traits that echo the oldest folklore almost note for note. The first and most obvious thread is isolation. Nearly every story takes place when the witness is alone. A man home by himself, a patrol officer separated from his partner, a mother in the quiet of evening. The moment there are other people around, the phenomenon seems to fade. Groups rarely hear the same voice at once, though history offers exceptions such as the Bell Witch witnesses or mountaineers who sensed a shared presence on the slopes. Still, in the overwhelming majority of reports, the voice comes to those who are solitary, those who can't turn to anyone else for immediate confirmation. The second trait is the timing. These experiences almost always unfold at night or in low light. Darkness, dusk, or the dim edges of dawn seem to invite them. It's as if the world's natural in-between states, neither full day nor full night, create space for the impossible. The mother who heard mommy at dusk, the policeman on his night patrol, the Texas man in the quiet of evening, all encountered their phantom voices in shadow. Daylight cases do exist, such as Shackleton's momentary presence during the Antarctic trek, or the Bell Witch's midday taunts, but they are rare. Liminal hours remain the preferred stage. A third constant is the familiarity of the sound. The voice never speaks in strange or cryptic language. It speaks as someone known would speak. It calls a name, repeats a pet phrase, or gives a short, casual instruction. Help me with the groceries. Come here. Over here. This brevity and precision make it all the more jarring. Witnesses insist the phrasing was exactly right, what their spouse or parent or friend would naturally say. The intimacy of that recognition pierces deeper than any shout or scream could. Then there is the emotional impact. No matter how rational or disciplined the listener, the reaction is visceral. Some describe the rush of panic, skin tightening, heartbeat spiking. Others, in the rare comforting cases, feel an overwhelming warmth as if touched by protection. But almost everyone reports that a primal instinct took over. Even hardened professionals, soldiers, rangers, police, admit to feeling an ancient terror that bypassed logic. It's as though the brain itself recognizes a fundamental wrongness when a trusted voice appears out of place, an auditory version of the uncanny valley. Equally consistent is the absence of any source. Modern witnesses are quick to check. They scan their phones, radios, televisions, intercoms, anything that could have broadcast a stray sound. Nothing ever fits. The more they search for a normal explanation, the more the mystery tightens its grip. That lack of origin often cements the experience as undeniably paranormal in their minds. And finally comes the matter of what happens when the call is answered. In story after story, following the voice leads only to danger or emptiness. Some end up lost, as if led in circles by a teasing presence. Others find nothing but silence where the voice had been. Only a few accounts describe beneficial outcomes, and those are framed as encounters with guardian spirits rather than tricksters. More often, the lesson is stark. The moment you step toward the familiar sound in the wrong place, it vanishes, leaving you stranded, frightened, and forever unsure of what you heard. Taken together, these traits form a clear portrait. The modern mimic may change its setting, city apartments instead of forest trails, but its habits have not evolved. It still waits for solitude, still chooses the twilight hour, still wears the mask of someone loved, and still punishes those who trust too quickly in what they think they know. All of these mirror the global patterns, with technology and contemporary settings being the only new variables. Indeed, one could compile hundreds of such stories from Reddit alone. It's almost overwhelming. Many will remain anecdotes, beyond proof or investigation. However, they matter in aggregate, because they indicate that whatever lies at the root, be it external entities or internal psychological quirks, is still very much active in human experience. In conclusion, the contemporary scene for our topic is one of both continuity and amplification. Continuity in that people are still hearing phantom calls by familiar voices, just as in antiquity. Amplification in that now these stories circulate widely and even get dramatized or investigated with gadgets, feeding back into belief systems. The ghost that mimics has arguably never had a larger audience or a more interconnected set of witnesses. In a sense, the mimics themselves have adapted. If one entertains the thought, once content to plague a single household or forest, now they go viral on YouTube EVP recordings, their eerie call heard by millions through speakers. They sound like us, and now we can record and replay those sounds ad infinitum. As we transition to a more analytical perspective next, it's worth contemplating the why. Why are we so universally haunted by the idea of something using our own voices against us? And what does this enduring motif say about our psyche, our evolution, and our relationship with the unknown? We have journeyed from campfire tales to digital forums, and the voices still call out from the dark, sounding like us. Next, we will attempt to answer that haunting question. Why does mimicry terrify, and what does it mean for us as humans who trust and fear our own senses in equal measure? Through every age and culture, one fear repeats itself, something that sounds familiar but isn't. Why does that simple twist feel so much worse than any other horror? Monsters may change, but the false voice cuts deeper than any face we can see. To understand why, we can look at a few simple truths about this fear. Now, we will examine several dimensions of this fear. The betrayal of trust it entails, the uncanny valley effect applied to sound, the exploitation of liminal vulnerabilities, and the possible natural versus supernatural interpretations that cultures assign. We will also consider the function such stories serve, as cautionary tales enforcing social and environmental boundaries, and as metaphors for broader human anxieties, even metaphysical warnings. Far from being mere ghost stories to scare children, the motif of the mimic taps into fundamental aspects of human psychology and social behavior. The reason hearing a trusted voice in an untrustworthy context is so devastating likely stems from our social evolution. Humans are deeply social creatures. Our survival historically depended on group cohesion, on trusting kin and companions. The sound of a loved one's voice triggers an innate sense of safety and belonging. Evolutionary psychologists might note it releases oxytocin, lowers guard, signals all is well. A mother's voice to a child is perhaps the most soothing sound in the world. Likewise, a friend's shout in the dark instantly alleviates the fear of solitude. Therefore, when something malicious co-opts that very safety signal, it is as if our emotional refuge has been weaponized against us. It's a betrayal on the most personal level, akin to a best friend stabbing you with a smile. Folklore often frames it literally as betrayal, a spirit pretending to be your parent or spouse, luring you. The false familiar is essentially a supernatural traitor. This undercuts our ability to trust anything, which is psychologically shattering. Consider the Bell Witch tormenting the family by imitating their eldest daughter Betsy's voice at times. The parents would hear Betsy's voice scream from one room, run in, and find her there saying she hadn't screamed. How unnerving for a parent. Your child's voice, your instinct is to protect, is used to play you for a fool. In many mimic cases, the emotional harm is as great as any physical harm that follows. People describe after an incident that they felt violated, even if nothing touched them. A modern witness said, "When I realized the voice I heard wasn't my wife at all, I felt sick to my stomach, like something had gotten inside my safe place and made it cold." That phrasing, "inside my safe place," is telling. Our loved ones' voices form part of the core of home, of sanity. To invade that sanctum is an ultimate trespass by the other. It reminds of demonic tropes. Demons in Christian tradition are said to sometimes imitate the voices of loved ones, to trick the vulnerable. In essence, the ultimate deceiver uses our greatest trust as disguise. This resonates with primal religious fears. The devil, as the father of lies, might not come with horns, but with a comforting voice. We often speak of the uncanny valley in terms of visuals, a robot or animation that looks almost human but not quite, causing revulsion. There is an analogous phenomenon with hearing. The uncanny valley of sound would be when something sounds almost exactly like a known voice, but perhaps subtly off in tone or occurring in an impossible context, triggering that same eerie revulsion. Luke Law's Brennan Storr, in the earlier excerpt, remarked how mimic stories make him feel icky on a phobic level. Science may have an inkling why. Our brains are extremely adept at voice recognition. Certain neurons fire specifically in response to hearing one's own name or one's mother's voice, honed since infancy. When those neurons fire but the overall context doesn't align, as in you hear your mother's voice but she is not present, it creates a neural dissonance. The brain essentially flags, this should not be. It's similar to how a face that is nearly human but slightly distorted sets off internal alarms. Here, the voice sets off an alarm of the unnatural. Dr. Oliver Sacks in his works mentioned patients with temporal lobe seizures who sometimes hallucinated music or voices. One patient said the most frightening was hearing his deceased father call his name, not because he believed a ghost, but because it felt real and impossible. That cognitive dissonance is like a glitch in the matrix, a crack in reality's reliability, frightening at a fundamental existential level. Folklore externalizes that as spirits, but the raw effect is the same. One could argue this effect is heightened at night or in isolation, because the brain is on higher alert for dangers. Hearing a friendly voice unexpectedly might normally be comforting, but the very unexpectedness and our deeper intuition that this environment should not contain that sound flips it to fear. People often describe the mimic voices as having a slight distortion. It sounded just like him, but not quite. That not quite is lethal to our sense of normalcy. It's the auditory equivalent of an uncanny lifeless eye in an otherwise human-like doll. As noted, these phenomena frequently occur in liminal situations, twilight between day and night, thresholds just outside the house, just beyond the campsite, to people in transitional states, alone, lost, nearly asleep, or emotionally vulnerable. Folklore explicitly links mimicry voices to such liminal contexts as a rule. Like, for example, Chinese ghost belief says the hour of dusk when yin and yang intermingle is prime time for a ghost to call. Anthropologically, thresholds are often where taboos and cautionary legends focus energy. Crossing from civilized space to wild space, home to forest, village to fields, always came with admonitions. The mimic spirits personify the hazard of crossing boundaries without care. For instance, Kurapira, calling out to lure someone deeper into the jungle. It's a literal boundary transgression tale. The hunter has stepped beyond safe or holy limits, into the domain of the forest spirit, and the spirit uses mimicry to entrap him further. Similarly, a child hearing a parent's voice beckoning them off the safe yard into the woods at night stands on the edge of known yard and unknown woods. The mimic voice is the siren song bridging that gap, playing on the trust from the known to draw them into the unknown. If we consider psychological liminality, people who are half asleep, fatigued, or alone with their thoughts might be more prone. Some voices might, indeed, be hypnagogic hallucinations in those edges of sleep, which in older times were not hallucinations but spirit communications. Interestingly, a scientific study noted that a common, benign auditory hallucination is hearing one's name called when falling asleep. Up to 15% of people have experienced that at least once. This is likely a brain misfire, but to a traditional mind, that might be a ghost or angel calling the soul. It is in these uncertain boundaries between wake and sleep, life and death, the Helen of Troy mimic example was to lure from hiding, essentially a death trap, interior and exterior world, that mimicry phenomena flourish. Thematically, it underscores the danger of the in-between. The voice calling one's name at that moment of twilight stands as a test. Do you remain anchored in reality? Don't respond. Or do you yield to the threshold, answer, and possibly be taken beyond? In a way, not answering a phantom call is an affirmation of staying put in the world of the living. Answering it might symbolically equate to stepping into the realm of spirits, hence the superstition of it portending death. From a rational perspective, one might catalogue various natural reasons for hearing a familiar voice when none should be present. Auditory pareidolia, misinterpreting random sounds like wind or animals as a voice. Indeed, mountain lions, foxes, and owls can make surprisingly human-like cries, a known cause behind some ghost calls. Memory echoes, the brain spontaneously playing a memory of a voice internally, but projecting it as if external, possibly in times of stress. We hear our parents' comforting voice as a coping mechanism, which could be externalized in consciousness. Neurological issues like mild temporal lobe epilepsy or waking dreams explaining single incidents in healthy individuals occasionally. We've touched on how isolating conditions, like in expeditions, can cause the mind to produce phantom companions, which are usually helpful, but sometimes could be frightening if one isn't aware of the phenomenon. Imagine a hiker not knowing about third man factor, hearing a friend's voice that isn't there. They'd probably think spirit mimic right away. However, these scientific angles do not necessarily invalidate the folklore. On the contrary, they show how persistent the phenomena is in human experience, requiring an explanation in every age. For many, the natural explanation is just as awe-inspiring. The idea that our brain can do this to us spontaneously reveals how delicate our grasp on reality might be, which is itself uncanny, and for the devout or those with spiritual worldview, these scientific factors might be seen as the mechanism through which the supernatural operates. For example, a ghost could use a passing breeze, or the percipient's momentary dreamlike state as the opportunity to imprint their voice. So modern analyses come in layered interpretations. An ethnographer might say, the Leshy legend served to warn people not to stray in the woods, pragmatic safety, and to personify the real dangers of echo confusion or predators mimicking sounds like baby cries, like how certain big cats have calls that can resemble a child, which might have fueled legends. Meanwhile, the villagers listening might fully believe the Leshy is a spirit, but also know practically that means don't get lost. Crucially, modern storytellers often refrain from debunking in the context of the narrative itself. An online forum dedicated to personal experiences will greet a mimic story with supportive comments. Yes, that happened to my cousin too, rather than, it was just in your head. The appetite is for connection of experiences, not reductionism. That's not to say critical analysis isn't done. Paranormal podcasts often discuss could it have been radio or a prank, but typically, if the story is compelling, they lean into a paranormal explanation because that's the culturally impactful one. If you simply tell someone you probably hallucinated your dead mum's voice, it doesn't address the emotional and symbolic weight of that event for them. Saying maybe your mum's spirit truly visited in voice form provides comfort, or at least a meaningful narrative to attach to it, which is psychologically satisfying. In that sense, these mimicry stories, no matter how explained, fulfill a human need to find meaning in eerie, boundary challenging experiences. Many of the traditional stories we examined clearly have didactic purposes. They teach listeners, especially children and those who might be foolhardy, to be cautious of deception and respectful of boundaries. For instance, the prevalence of such tales among indigenous communities regarding the forest or wilderness fosters a healthy wariness in young people venturing out alone. A child who's been told by elders, if you hear your name in the woods, it's a bad spirit trying to lure you, is likely to think twice before following a strange call, which practically could save them from getting lost or from walking into a predator's ambush. Even in urban settings, the idea of not immediately trusting a voice can be metaphorically useful. One is taught to verify, not to go with any stranger who calls their name. Stranger danger could be couched in these terms in older times. A fairy or jinn might call you by imitating your parents' voice to kidnap you, which in modern terms could parallel a cunning human kidnapper calling a child saying, I'm a friend of your mum, come with me. So these stories emphasize situational awareness. They also enforce community boundaries by implying that beyond the safe zone, the village, the light of the campfire, trickster spirits hold sway. They discourage youths from straying far or at night, preserving group safety and perhaps resource respect, like Kurapira punishing overhunting. Beyond safety, there's a moral element. Trust is sacred, and these tales emphasize how awful betrayal of trust is by depicting it in supernatural extreme. A common theme in mimic stories globally is that those who heed the false voice suffer, showing the importance of discernment and perhaps hinting at deeper morale. Not everything familiar is good, one must judge by context and intuition as well. In societies where obedience to elders was paramount, mimic tales sometimes invert that to show there are times you must not obey the voice of mother or father if it appears in unnatural circumstances. An interesting nuance that perhaps encourages independent judgment in extreme scenarios, a subtle cognitive skill. For those inclined to see a spiritual world, mimicry entities often are characterized as demonic or elemental. The idea of a demon in Abrahamic traditions is often one of a deceiver. In Christian demonology, demons can impersonate the dead to trick the living. That aligns perfectly with our motif. Thus, a Catholic might interpret a voice that sounds like their late grandmother calling them at night not as grandma's ghost, since Catholic doctrine would be wary of that, but as a demon trying to lure them into despair or to playing with occult contact. Indeed, Ed Warren, the famed demonologist, wrote that one hallmark of demonic infestation is imitation. The inhuman spirit may imitate the voice of a loved one to confuse and frighten. Meanwhile, a neo-pagan or animist might view these voices as elemental fae or nature spirits testing them, or malevolent ones aiming to lead them astray from their path, both literally and spiritually. A modern medium might claim the ability to hear spirits and caution that lower astral entities might pretend to be your friend's spirit to gain your trust. Always confirm identity via multiple means. Interestingly, the false familiar concept appears in occult literature as a danger when using Ouija boards or EVP. That is, an entity might pretend to be your kind grandmother when it's actually something else. This leads to the advice, treat unknown voices with caution, even if they sound sweet. Once again, trust but verify. Ironically, the same guidance as any social interaction but applied to spirits. A more psychological metaphysical view might say mimic voices are projection of our subconscious, so perhaps they reveal inner desires or fears. For example, hearing a deceased relative might be the subconscious manifesting either the longing for them or unresolved issues if the voice is angry. Hearing one's name called when one is lost might be the inner voice pushing one to not give up, externalized as a friend's call, a form of self-rescue mechanism. In that interpretation, the motif persists because it's literally built into how our minds sometimes solve problems, like Shackleton's guiding presence. But then, why the often negative bent? Possibly because our survival bias as a species is to err on side of caution. Any unknown voice might be dangerous, the same reason we find illusions in shadows. Better to see a predator that isn't there than miss one that is. So, evolutionary, we have a predisposition to feel fear at disembodied voices, which culture then codified into spirits. It's fascinating how evolution and folklore dance together. If at night some primal part of the brain freaks out and generates what sounds like a voice calling you, the cultural explanation might become bad spirit, which then reinforces individuals to be careful at night, which ironically is exactly what the evolutionary impulse wanted, them to be cautious. In that lens, mimicry stories are an exquisite example of how deeply our evolutionary psychology can shape and be shaped by narrative. The fact that here in 2025 we can have a lengthy discourse on this, with new examples from recent years, shows this motif is not going away. It's adaptable, resonant, and deeply embedded in human experience. People still tell mimic ghost stories because they still scare us profoundly. Films and literature use it to great effect. Who can forget scenes in horror movies where a character hears a friend calling, only to find emptiness? An almost cliché scare tactic now, precisely because it works so reliably on audiences. In a sense, the mimic trope connects with fundamental fears. Fear of deception, fear of the unknown wearing the known's face, fear of loss of sanity. If you hear voices no one else does, a piece of you fears for your mind, and the ultimate fear, that the world is not as orderly and safe as it seems, that even our beloved family might not truly be them, but something imposterous in the dark. Think of body snatcher and doppelganger myths. Voice mimic is the audible version of that horror of loved ones replaced. No matter how rational our world becomes, that shiver remains when we hear our name spoken with no one around. We may laugh it off when it happens in broad day. Heh, thought I heard someone. Must have been the wind. But later that night, perhaps we double-check the locked door, or think of Grandma's ghost and say a little prayer, just in case. In the quiet of our primal selves, we still harbor the caution our ancestors inscribed in stories of the false familiar. Having probed the why and meaning of this phenomenon, we are better prepared to step back and see the entire panorama, how mimicry tales compare across cultures, and what they collectively might be telling us about being human. Next, a cross-cultural comparison will allow us to appreciate the variations and constants, synthesizing the journey we've taken through whispered folk tales and recorded echoes. Through it all, one thing is evident. These voices from the dark, though terrifying, have taught and bound communities together in shared fear and wonder. Perhaps in understanding them, we understand a bit more about ourselves, the voices within that sound like us, but maybe aren't entirely us either. We've walked through centuries of belief and theory, but stories speak louder than analysis. From this point forward, we'll move through 5 full accounts drawn from different eras and landscapes, each told as it was remembered or recorded. One will take us deep into a European forest, another into the quiet of an old house, another onto an empty American highway. One will revisit a legendary haunting, and finally, one will bring us into the age of recorders and cameras. Together, these cases form a living thread of evidence, showing that the mimic's voice has never left us. It has only changed its setting. The first story takes us back to the 19th century, into the deep forests of Eastern Europe, where the line between nature and spirit was as thin as the fog that drifted through the trees. The pine trees stood tall and inscrutable in the late afternoon light, the forest floor already dimming to dusk. Johann Meixner, a trapper of the old world tradition, carefully picked his way through the Carpathian woodlands in search of his snares. The year was 1820, and though the forests of Transylvania were still vast, they had grown quieter over the years of hunting. Johann was mindful of this. He muttered a quick prayer of thanks whenever he took a hare or fox, as he'd been taught by his grandfather. This evening, as the sun's rays slanted golden between black trunks, Johann felt a peculiar hush in the air. The usual forest sounds, rustling leaves, distant bird calls, had fallen into an expectant silence. He had the strangest sense he was not alone. Indeed, he kept thinking he saw a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, a pale shape slipping behind a gnarled oak, the blur of what might be a person or an animal keeping pace with him at a distance. Yet whenever he snapped his head in that direction, he saw only still trees and deepening shadows. He came upon one of his snares, empty and sprung. Perhaps a clever fox had stolen the bait. Sighing, Johann knelt to reset it. As he did, a sound drifted through the silence. His name softly carried, Johann. It was a woman's voice, low and musical, almost playful. Johann felt a sudden chill despite the lingering warmth of day. His fingers paused in their work. Johann, came the voice again, from somewhere to his left, deeper among the tall pines. It sounded like Anna, the widow from the village who sometimes visited his cottage to trade cheese for furs. The accent, the gentle roll of the J, was unmistakably hers, and she was calling as if smiling, inviting. Johann stood slowly, heart thumping. What would Anna be doing out here, alone and off the path? Anna? He called back perplexed. Is that you? A brief silence, then a lilting laugh answered. Yes, it sounded like Anna's warm laugh, but something about it was off, as if echoing oddly, lacking fullness. Nonetheless, impulsively, Johann took a few steps toward the source. Anna, are you in need? Why are you here? He called, squinting between the boles of trees where the light now pooled in dusky blue. Come here, Johann, the voice answered, clear as a bell, yet originating from no distinct spot. It seemed to emanate from the dusky undergrowth itself. I found something. Come see. The last words trailed in a sing-song murmur. Johann's stomach tightened. A sense of wrongness fell upon him. How could Anna be here? The village was a good 2 miles away. She must have followed him, but why not hail him sooner? And her tone, it was playful, almost too playful for the circumstances. It reminded him absurdly of how one might coax a cat. He remembered suddenly the cautionary tales his grandfather had told by the hearth, of the lesnik or forest spirit, which the old folks said could mimic voices to lure wanderers off the safe trails. His grandfather had lowered his voice and said, if you ever hear your name called by a voice you know, in a place it cannot be, do not follow. The lesnik calls you to your doom. At the time, Johann, a rational young man, had dismissed it as just a ghost story to spook children. But now every hair on his arms was stiff. He realized nightfall was creeping up. The woods were taking on that indistinct gloom. Swallowing hard, Johann responded, if you are truly Anna, come out where I can see you. He tried to keep his voice steady, but it carried a tremor. A soft giggle echoed from behind a cluster of firs. For a moment, in a shaft of waning light, he thought he saw a slender figure peep out, a hint of a woman's face half concealed by a tree trunk. But it was too shadowy to tell for sure. It withdrew quickly. Come, Johann, why are you shy? The voice drifted again, now from a slightly different direction, circling him. It was Anna's voice, and yet a part of him screamed that it was not. The cadence had a hollow ring beneath the honeyed exterior, like an impersonation that was almost perfect, yet soulless. Johann felt a surge of fear mixed with a strange pull. If it truly were Anna, she could be in danger or playing some unusual game. If it was not, he felt eyes on him from all sides, the unseen presence among the trees. Clutching his hunting knife, he backed up a step. He remembered another bit of lore. The way to break a lesnik's influence was to confuse it or show courage. One method his grandfather joked about was to put your clothes on backwards, to confound the spirit. Johann had laughed then, but right now he was willing to try anything. Keeping his gaze toward the last voice, he shrugged off his fur-lined coat and hastily flipped it inside out and backwards, tying it oddly around himself. It made him feel a touch more protected, as if honoring the old wisdom. The forest was now nearly dark. I will not come unless you show yourself, he shouted, making his voice as firm as he could. There was silence. Then a sigh, almost of disappointment, from very close behind him. His heart lurched. The voice was just over his shoulder. He spun around, slashing the knife through empty air. In that same instant, a powerful gust of wind whipped through the clearing, blasting pine needles and dust into his face. Johann staggered, raising an arm. The wind roared in the treetops, and within it he almost fancied he heard an angry, wordless howl, a voice no longer Anna's, but something ancient and enraged. Then, as quickly as it had come, the wind died. The woods fell deathly still again. Johann stood gasping, turning in a full circle. "Show yourself," he barked to no reply. Only the settling tick of branches answered. The presence, whatever it was, seemed to have withdrawn. For now. Shaking, Johann made a decision. Keeping his backwards coat on and gripping his knife tightly, he began to walk briskly back toward the known path, toward home. He whispered a prayer to the Virgin and muttered every charm against evil he could recall. The forest seemed to accept his departure. No voice followed, no laughter trailed. After several agonizing minutes, he saw the outline of his cottage's chimney through the trees ahead and nearly sobbed in relief. Later that night, safe by his hearth, Johann sat and reflected on his close call. He told a village elder what happened. The old man nodded gravely and said, "The Leshy tried to trick you. It does that with men who roam too deep at dusk. You did well not to follow, lad. Many who do are found at the bottom of ravines, or not at all." Johann realized how lucky he'd been. The familiar voice in the forest was no friendly acquaintance, but something wild and perilous, testing his wisdom. Never again would he wander so late, nor scoff at the warnings in the old stories. He had heard the false familiar with his own ears, and it nearly bewitched him into darkness. In the flicker of his hearth flames, he murmured a thank you to his grandfather's spirit for arming him with folklore, and offered a pinch of tobacco tossed into the fire, a small appeasement to the forest lord that he escaped. Far away in the woods, an owl hooted into the night, and the pine silhouette stood silent and inscrutable once more. Johann crossed himself and barred his door, the memory of that sweet, deadly voice still ringing in his mind. This case illustrated the classic wilderness scenario, a forest spirit, the Leshy, mimicking a loved one's voice to lure a hunter. It showed the emotional temptation and the cultural protective measures, wearing clothes backward, invoking prayer, which helped the protagonist escape. It's grounded in 19th century Eastern Europe, but echoes countless such stories globally. From the wilderness, the setting shifts inward to the quiet safety of home, where one widow discovers that even four walls and a locked door cannot always keep the voices out. Margaret Maggie Bell had lived in her quaint New England farmhouse for nearly 40 years. It was a modest, white clapboard home on the outskirts of a small town in Maine. By 1977, Maggie was recently widowed. Her husband Jim had passed 2 autumns prior. Her children were grown with families of their own, scattered across the country. Thus Maggie, at 68, lived alone in that creaky, beloved house filled with memories. One February evening, Maggie stood at the kitchen sink, washing the last of her supper dishes. Outside, a nor'easter wind howled and flung pellets of icy snow against the window panes. The kitchen was warm and steamy, her radio softly playing an old Glenn Miller tune. The familiar routine soothed her. Though widowed, she kept to the habits she and Jim once shared, including tidying up promptly at 7 p.m. As she drained the sink, Maggie heard something over the Glenn Miller music. A voice? She turned down the radio. It was a voice, muffled, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. She wiped her hands and listened hard. "Maggie, Maggie." It was Jim's voice calling her name, faint but unmistakable in tone. Maggie's heart gave a leap. Jim! It sounded like he was in the living room. But that's impossible, she thought with a surge of cold confusion. She hurried through the swinging door into the living room. The floral armchair by the fireplace, Jim's chair, sat empty in the dim lamplight. The room was empty. The only sound was the wind rattling the eaves. Maggie stood there, dish towel in hand, mouth dry. She could have sworn she heard him, heard Jim. 2 years gone, yet for a moment it was as if. Maggie chided herself. Grief does strange things. Perhaps she'd been thinking of him and imagined it. Shaking her head, she resumed humming the tune that was playing and went upstairs to draw a hot bath. Later that night, tucked in bed with the storm still raging outside, Maggie drifted towards sleep, but a noise jerked her awake. It was the voice again, Jim's voice calling from downstairs. "Maggie!" This time it was louder, urgent, the way he'd call if he needed help with something. Maggie's eyes flew open. She absolutely recognized it. She sat up, heart pounding. The house was mostly dark, a nightlight in the hall casting faint blue shadows. Had someone broken in and was cruelly imitating her late husband? That made no sense. "Hello?" she called, voice trembling. No answer, just the moan of the wind. Clutching her robe around her, Maggie swung her feet out of bed. She hesitated, fear and hope warring within her. If it were Jim, what did that mean? Her sensible mind said, it can't be him. But her heart had yearned to hear his voice so badly. The thought that he might be reaching out, she had to know. Maggie crept to the top of the staircase. "Jim!" she called softly into the darkness below. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the foyer and living room briefly in stark white. In that split second, Maggie's breath caught, for she thought she saw a figure standing by the front door, a familiar outline, tall with the slope of shoulders that looked like Jim's old tweed coat. Thunder crashed, the lights flickered. Maggie gripped the banister. "Jim?" she whispered again, voice quavering. Another flash, the figure was closer to the stairs now. Maggie squinted. The features were obscured by shadow, but she felt sure it was looking up at her. She could smell suddenly the faint odor of pipe tobacco, Jim's blend. Her eyes welled with tears at that warm, homey smell. "My love," came the voice from below, in Jim's gentle timbre. "Come down, dear." Half sob, half laugh, Maggie rushed down a few steps. "Jim, I I can't believe—" She stopped. Something in her gut tightened with unease. The voice had sounded exactly like him. Yes, but oddly flat, as if echoing in a tin can. And he never called her my love in such a direct way. He had pet names, Mags or Darlin. She paused on the middle of the staircase, peering through the dim. The figure was at the foot of the steps now. In the strobing flash of another lightning bolt, she saw its face clearly, and nearly screamed. It was Jim, and yet not Jim. His features were as she remembered, but pale and glassy, the eyes reflecting light like an animal's. His mouth was stretched in a fixed, unnatural smile. Worst of all, his feet were not touching the floor. The figure hovered an inch or two above the rug. Maggie's hand flew to her mouth. She wanted to cry out, but terror froze her voice. The thing that wore her husband's face spoke again, softly. "Come down, Maggie. I've missed you so." But now, to her ears, the beloved voice held a razor's edge of coldness. It was like listening to Jim speak from under deep water, distorted, wrong. Lightning flashed once more, and in that searing light, Maggie saw the face begin to change, the jaw elongating subtly, the eyes sinking. She realized with dawning horror that this was not her Jim. Whatever this apparition was, it was mimicking him to draw her closer. Raw panic overcame her. Maggie clutched her cross necklace. "You're not him. Get away from me," she cried, stumbling back up the stairs. The thing's false smile dropped into a sneer. The voice that had been sweet turned into a guttural growl. "Stubborn woman," it rasped, still in Jim's pitch but dripping malice. "Don't you want to be with your husband?" Maggie bolted. She dashed into her bedroom and slammed the door, locking it. Her heart hammered. The wind rattled the windows as violently as if the storm itself was angered. Maggie backed against the far wall, eyes on the door. From the hall she heard a scrape and a soft tapping on her door. Then his voice again, tender and cajoling. "Maggie, honey, I'm sorry. Please, let's not be apart." Tears streamed down Maggie's cheeks. She clutched the cross and her wedding band, and in a desperate voice began to pray aloud. "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." Her words shook, but she repeated the prayer again and again, a plea for protection. The knob of the door rattled as the thing outside tested it. The voice, no longer perfectly imitating Jim, but a horrid half-yawn of his tone, began to snarl low obscenities at her, its patience apparently gone. "You old fool, let me in, or I'll—" The rest dissolved into growls like an animal. Maggie shut her eyes tight, continuing to pray fervently. Suddenly, an outright bang hit the door, causing it to quiver on its hinges. Maggie screamed and fell to her knees. Bang! Another heavy blow. It sounded like something very strong was trying to break it down. In her mind, she flashed on a story her grandmother told of a demon that tried to attack a widow by mimicking her late husband. The only thing that drove it off was calling on God and the beloved spirit to intervene. With a surge of resolve born of faith and fury, Maggie shouted through sobs, "In the name of God and the real James Bell, I command you to leave me be." The furious pounding stopped. There was a noise, a shriek that swelled and dopplered away, as if whatever it was flew out the hall window. The wind outside exploded in a gust that shrieked around the eaves, then abruptly fell dead calm. Maggie stayed huddled, clutching her cross, rocking and crying, until the silence of the house felt normal again. Eventually she dared to unlock and open her door. The hallway was empty, lit only by that small nightlight. Down the stairs, through the foyer window, she could see the storm clouds passing to reveal a bright full moon. She crept downstairs. The living room lay exactly as it had, except Jim's armchair was turned away from the fireplace now, as if moved. Approaching it warily, she found on the side table next to the chair was Jim's old tobacco pipe, which she kept stored in a curio cabinet. The pipe was warm to the touch, with a wisp of smoke still curling from the bowl, as if someone or something had been just there, having a leisurely smoke while waiting for her. Maggie gently picked up the pipe and held it to her chest. She closed her eyes and breathed in the lingering scent of Jim's tobacco. In her mind, she spoke to her husband. "If that was truly you in any way, my love, I'm not ready to follow yet. If it was not you, thank you for giving me the strength to send it away." A sense of peace stole over her, as if an answer. She knew the voice masquerading as her dear one would likely return or try again. Tricksters seldom give up easily, but Maggie Bell would be ready. She had faced it and lived, armed with nothing but prayer and love and the sure knowledge of what her husband's voice truly felt like. That subtle wrongness had given it away. She would not be fooled. That night, as she finally returned to bed, Maggie placed his pipe and her rosary together on the nightstand as twin guardians. The moonlight spilled kindly into the room, and she slept, fitfully but unharmed, while somewhere far in the dark outside, an angry echo faded into nothing, denied its prize by the strength of a widow's faith and the timeless bond that even the cleverest mimic could not counterfeit. This case study shows a domestic context, a widow hearing her late husband's voice. It combined emotional temptation, wanting it to be him, with the realization of deception and a confrontation where faith and love repelled the entity. It also referenced traditional demonology views, imposter voices as demonic, and gave a specific mid-late 20th century setting for relatability. Generations later, the same pattern unfolds beneath the vast desert sky. This time, the mimic waits on a lonely highway, wearing the sound of a mother's voice. Highway 89 cuts through long stretches of Navajo Nation land in northern Arizona, a lonely ribbon of asphalt flanked by mesas and desert brush. In September 2013, a young Navajo man named Kyle was driving that route at dusk, heading home to Tuba City after visiting relatives. His little brother Daniel, 12, rode in the passenger seat, dozing against the window as the last orange light faded behind the buttes. As the highway climbed onto a plateau, the radio signal became static. The sky was a deep cobalt, Venus and a few early stars blinking out. Kyle switched off the radio, enveloping them in silence except for the wind through the truck's slightly open wing windows. Suddenly, Daniel snapped awake with a small gasp. Kyle glanced over. His brother was staring intently out into the scrubland on their right. "Did you hear that?" Daniel asked, voice thin. "Hear what?" Kyle eased off the gas. The road was empty. Theirs were the only headlights piercing the gloom. I thought I heard someone calling," Daniel murmured, craning his neck toward the open window. Kyle slowed the truck to a crawl and lowered his own window. They listened, only the soft hiss of desert wind. "Maybe the wind sounded like something," Kyle suggested, but his brother looked unconvinced, brow furrowed. Kyle resumed speed. The tires hummed on the pavement. A minute later, he heard it too. A distant voice, very faint, calling from the darkness off to the right. He instinctively tapped the brakes. From the passenger side, out in the desert scrub, "Kyle! Help!" It was a woman's voice calling his name clearly. Kyle felt ice in his veins. The voice sounded exactly like their mother. Daniel whipped his head around, eyes wide. "That's Mom," he exclaimed. It did sound like Mom. The tone, the pitch, and she was yelling for help. Without thinking, Kyle pulled the truck onto the shoulder, gravel crunching. Their mother, however, should be at home, miles away. Why would she be out here in the middle of nowhere at night? The impossibility of it set in, and Kyle felt a wave of dread. Kyle! Daniel! The woman's voice echoed again, slightly more urgent. It definitely came from the right side of the road, maybe 100 yards out in the sagebrush and juniper. There was a rocky ravine out that way, leading toward the Monave Wash. Daniel reached for his door handle, frantic. It's Mom. Maybe she's hurt out there. But Kyle grabbed his brother's arm. No, he said, heart thudding. Mum's at home. That's not her. He spoke with more certainty than he felt. How can you be sure? It sounds just like her. Daniel protested, tears in his eyes. The voice was tugging at the little boy's loyalty and fear for his mother. Kyle's mind raced. 2 days ago, an older cousin had warned them while sitting around a campfire. Be careful out there. Strange things have been reported. Skinwalkers and other entities that mimic voices at night to lure people. At the time, Kyle had scoffed, thinking it was just to scare Daniel. But now, hearing that perfect imitation of their mother in a place she absolutely could not be, his thoughts went to the tales. This stretch of road was near where some had claimed to see a shapeshifter. Kyle! Help me! The cry came once more, pleading. Daniel struggled, panicked. She's calling for help. We can't just do nothing. Kyle felt the pull too. Every instinct as a son urged him to run to his mother's aid. Yet his skin crawled with primal fear. The voice, though exactly like his mother's, had an emptiness to it, hard to describe, as if devoid of the warmth that would normally accompany her words. Summoning courage, Kyle did something his uncle once advised. He rolled down the passenger window completely and shouted out into the desert in Navajo, "We are not food, leave us alone." His voice echoed against the looming rock formations. An uncanny silence fell. The next moment something emerged from the brush, stepping into the beam of the truck's headlights on the right side. Daniel gasped. It was a tall, thin figure, human-like in shape, but ashen-skinned and clad in a tattered cloth. It stood perhaps 50 yards away. Its face was shadowed, but as it turned toward them, the brothers saw reflective eyes, like an animal's in the light. It opened its mouth, and out came their mother's voice one more time, now disjointed and eerie. Help, please, help. But the words were toneless, as if played on a damaged recorder. Daniel whimpered. Kyle knew then this was the Yi Nald Lushi, the skinwalker of legend. He'd been raised not to speak of them openly, as even naming them could draw attention. But here one stood, using his mother's voice to try to draw them out. Anger surged through his fear. How dare this thing use his mother as bait? He remembered another protection his grandmother insisted on, a pouch of corn pollen she gave him that summer for blessings. With trembling hands, Kyle fumbled in the glove box where he kept it. The figure in the headlights began to lope toward the truck, moving with an unnatural, bone-bending gait. Kyle, go! Go! Daniel cried, locking his door. Kyle grabbed the little leather pouch of pollen and, leaning out his window, blew a pinch of it into the night while shouting a Navajo protection prayer he'd heard his grandmother use. His voice quivered, but he poured his heart into it, asking the holy people for shielding and telling the trickster to depart. The shape halted in its tracks perhaps 20 yards away. It cocked its head as if in confusion or frustration, then, emitting a shrill, cackling screech utterly unlike any human voice, a sound that echoed of coyote and raven in anguish, it turned and scuttled up the rocky slope at impossible speed, disappearing into the darkness above the range. Kyle didn't wait to analyze. He slammed the truck into gear and peeled out back onto the highway, tearing down the road. Daniel burst into tears, partly of relief, partly lingering terror. Kyle put a comforting hand on his shoulder, himself shaking from adrenaline come down. They drove in silence for several miles until the lights of Tuba City appeared ahead. Only then did they speak. It wasn't Mom. It wasn't Mom, Daniel kept saying, as if convincing himself. No, it wasn't, Kyle affirmed quietly. He realized tears were on his own cheeks too. But whatever it was, it's gone now. He silently thanked the wisdom of their elders for arming them with prayers and pollen. In his mind, he also apologized to his ancestors for nearly falling for the lure. He had doubted and almost paid for it. They reached home safely, where their very real mother embraced them, alarmed by their pale faces and trembling bodies. They didn't tell her details, for one doesn't speak of skinwalkers freely. only that they'd had a scare on the road. She prepared herbal tea and rubbed cedar ash on their foreheads in blessing, intuing more than they said. That night, Daniel slept in Kyle's room. Both brothers knew what nearly happened and felt grateful to have escaped. In whispers, they vowed never to drive that route after dark again, and they would heed their culture's teachings henceforth with utmost respect. Outside their window, a coyote howled at the moon, a lone, haunting cry. The brothers stiffened, but their mother, hearing it from the other room, casually remarked how beautiful it was. To them now, it was not beautiful, but a chilling reminder. Yet they took comfort that the creature they encountered had been thwarted. This time, they were safe under their mother's roof, protected by family love and sacred traditions from whatever mimic voices prowled the high desert night. This narrative showcased a roadside encounter with a suspected skinwalker mimicking the voice of a loved one, including the use of cultural knowledge, Navajo language, corn pollen, prayer, to repel it. It highlights how modern indigenous people might handle such an experience, blending fear with traditional practices. To understand how old and powerful this deception can be, we return to one of the most famous hauntings in American history, an entity whose gift for imitation turned a farmhouse into legend. This case is drawn from the historical Bell Witch legend, which I have already covered on the channel, but here retold focusing on its voice mimic aspects. Late one summer evening in 1818, on a farm in Adams, Tennessee, John Bell sat on his front porch smoking his pipe, watching the dusk settle purple over the fields. Inside the log house, a lively conversation was taking place, or so it seemed at first. John could distinctly hear two voices speaking in the parlor. One was his wife Lucy's gentle southern drawl, the other a harsher whispering tone he didn't recognize. They appeared to be in argument, though low. John furrowed his brow. Lucy should be alone in there. The children were abed and the neighbors had long gone home. So who on earth was she talking to? He tapped out his pipe and rose, heart thumping with uneasy curiosity. As he stepped to the doorway, the conversation abruptly ceased. Pushing open the door, John found the parlor empty, Lucy's rocking chair swaying slightly as if someone had just left it. Lucy herself stood by the hearth, knitting in hand, eyes wide and worried. "Who are you just speaking with, dear?" John asked slowly. Lucy's face was pale. "John, I thought I was speaking to you," she stammered. "To me?" "I was on the porch," he answered, a chill creeping into his bones. Lucy swallowed. She explained that she'd been sitting and humming a hymn when John's voice, or something exactly like it, spoke to her from the empty rocking chair. It had chuckled and complimented her singing in John's tone. Startled, she had responded, thinking perhaps John was playing a prank out of sight, but then the voice said cruel, mocking things that John would never say. Lucy realized in horror it wasn't her husband at all, and she'd demanded it name itself. That's when John himself walked in and the presence vanished. John's blood ran cold. This mysterious, disembodied voice had been plaguing their household on and off for months now. The Bell Witch, they called it. It often spoke in multiple voices, but to mimic John's so perfectly to his wife, that was a new, bold trick. As husband and wife conferred in frightened whispers, suddenly a loud, clear laugh erupted from above their heads, as if perched on the rafters. It was John's own laugh duplicated, but warped with a sneering edge. Both Bells whipped their heads up. From the dark ceiling, the laugh transformed seamlessly into a chorus of two voices, one John's, one Lucy's, now conversing with each other, their voices tossed around like playthings by the invisible witch. "Well, Lucy, darling, we fooled him good," said John merrily. "Yes, we did, the old fool," replied Lucy with biting contempt. John Bell, a man not easily cowed, felt anger rising past his fear. "You deceitful spirit, cease that at once," he shouted into the empty air. The rafters quaked with a sudden force. In a voice now identical to John's late mother's, who had been dead 10 years, the witch began to wail, "John, John, why do you scold me so?" Hearing his beloved mother's tone used in that mocking cry nearly unmanned John. He trembled violently. Lucy, summoning her wits, snatched up the family Bible from the mantel. In a firm voice she began to read aloud a passage. "Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God." A ghastly shriek interrupted her, followed by John's mother's voice cursing vilely. words that saintly woman would never utter. John stepped forward and joined Lucy in reciting scripture. Their voices overlapped firmly, drowning out the mimic's profanities. A sudden gust of wind, though all doors were shut, blasted through the parlor, snuffing the oil lamp and casting them into darkness. The witch's cacophony of stolen voices rose all around. John's voice, Lucy's, their children's, even clucking like the family's old hen. A terrifying medley meant to confuse and terrify. But the bells kept praying loudly in unison. Then, as abruptly as it began, the wind died and the cacophony fell silent. The only sound was John's heavy breathing and Lucy quietly sobbing with the strain. In the gloom, something shattered. The porch window had cracked as if struck from outside. John relit the lamp with shaking hands. They sensed the witch had withdrawn for now. It had shown tonight it could adopt any voice dear to them and twist it, and it delighted in doing so. That merry, evil laugh lingered in their minds. John put a protective arm around his wife. "This is a trial like Job's," he murmured quietly. "It wants to break our unity by turning our own voices against us." Lucy nodded, eyes red but resolute. "We must not let it. When it mimics you, I'll remember the true you and not be fooled, and you the same when it mimics me." They agreed to always verify each other's presence now, a secret phrase to challenge any uncanny conversation if it happened again, and indeed it would many times, as the Bell Witch legend goes. They chose a simple code. If one heard the other speak from an empty room, they would ask, "Who goes there?" The real John or Lucy would respond with a pet name only they used. The witch, not privy to their intimate secrets, would be caught out, and indeed, later that week John nearly fell for a mimic of Lucy calling him to the barn. When he asked, "Who goes there?" the spirit, thinking itself clever, answered, "It's me, of course," but crucially omitted the pet name, alerting John to grab his gun and holy water instead of rushing in. That night the bells slept little, but they faced the darkness side by side in bed, whispering encouragement. The witch did not disturb their rest further, perhaps fatigued by their strong resistance and recitations. The next morning John found on the porch the remnants of one of their family portraits, the glass smashed, the faces of himself and Lucy scratched out by unseen claws. A chill went through him seeing that symbolic assault, but he calmly showed it to Lucy, and they disposed of it. They knew the battle of wills was ongoing, and so the Bell Witch continued its siege on the family, but never could it fully sunder John and Lucy's trust. Each time it spoke in their voices, they steeled themselves with faith and cleverness, turning the tables by calling it out. Neighbors who visited heard these spectral imitations and marveled, the legends spreading far and wide. Many came to test the witch with questions, and it would answer in voices of relatives or in multiple voices at once, astounding onlookers. The mimicry was its show of power, but to the bells it was also its flaw. By overplaying its hand with so many impersonations, it proved itself again and again a lying spirit, not to be believed at face value. In the end, that knowledge, that whatever honeyed voice the witch might use, it was not truly their loved ones, gave the Bell family the strength to endure. They suffered from the witch's torments, and John ultimately took ill under its curse. But it did not win their souls or sanity. To this day, in Adams, Tennessee, folks tell of how the Bell Witch could speak in all voices, even once reciting 2 different sermons at the same time from miles apart. But they also note that in spite of its uncanny ventriloquism, it could not ultimately trick Lucy Bell into betraying her husband or vice versa. The family's bond and a good measure of righteous defiance kept the malicious mimic at bay, and in that is a lesson told around many a southern campfire. The devil may come speaking with the tongue of an angel, but a pure heart and clear mind will see through the ruse. The story of the Bell Witch's mimicry remains one of the most famous attestations that not every familiar voice is true, a warning from history echoing the admonitions of folklore everywhere. This case study dramatized the Bell Witch incident, focusing on its mimicry of John and Lucy's voices and others, showing how the family responded and recognized the deception. It underscores themes of unity and faith in combating the false voices. It's an example of a historical haunting with extreme voice mimic phenomena. And finally, we step into the present day, into a world of recorders, flashlights, and cameras, where 2 investigators discover that even in the age of technology, The old voices have not gone silent. On a crisp October night in 2019, two paranormal investigators, Sarah and Mike, found themselves inside an abandoned 19th century hospital in Pennsylvania. The brick edifice loomed, windows empty and dark, as they set up their audio equipment in what had once been the children's ward. They were part of a small team filming an episode for a web series on haunted locations. This hospital had a morbid local legend. In the 1870s, a deranged nurse supposedly lured patients to their deaths by calling them in the voice of a loved one. A story likely fabricated over time, but it made the rounds. Sarah, a skeptic by nature, rolled her eyes at the cliché of it. Still, she couldn't deny the atmosphere was eerie. Peeling wallpaper, moonlight slanting through broken panes, and the silence heavy as the grave. They began an EVP session. Mike held a digital recorder and asked typical questions to the darkness. Is there anyone here with us? Do you have a message? The plan was to ask for mimics specifically, given the law. After a few minutes of only distant dripping water and their own shuffling, Mike tried a provocative approach. He knew from research that sometimes acknowledging a spirit's trickery could stir activity. So he said aloud, "We hear someone here likes to imitate voices. Why do you do that? Are you trying to scare people?" They waited. Sarah watched the electromagnetic meter, which remained baseline. "Nothing," she whispered. Mike then suggested something daring. "Maybe try calling me in my voice?" he said to the darkness with a nervous chuckle. "If you're really here, mimic me." They fell silent, recorders running. Sarah felt goosebumps on her arms. The musty corridor ahead was pitch black beyond their flashlight beams. Suddenly, from the inky hall to their left, a sound emerged, a faint whistling tune, one Sarah immediately recognized. It was a unique, folksy melody. Mike's whistling, something he did absent-mindedly often. In fact, he had whistled that very tune earlier while setting up cables. Mike's face went pale. That's me," he stammered quietly. The whistling continued for a few bars, then stopped abruptly. The investigators were frozen. The digital recorder's red light blinked, capturing everything. Sarah swallowed. "Thank you," she forced out, voice echoing. "Can you do anything else?" Her heart was pounding. Intellectually, she had prepared for phenomena, but experiencing it was jarring. The silence now felt expectant. Then a voice called softly from down the corridor. "Sarah, come here." It was Mike's voice, but distorted, stretched thin like a recording played a tad slow. Sarah and Mike looked at each other. Mike hadn't spoken. His lips were pressed together, jaw clenched in astonishment. That voice definitely was not him, though it bore his inflection uncannily. Sarah decided to follow protocol, challenge the entity. "Who is that?" "You're not Mike. Identify yourself," she said with as much authority as she could muster, shining her flashlight toward where the voice came. A brief static-like noise came from their walkie-talkie on Sarah's belt, just white noise. Then behind them, at the opposite end of the ward, came a different voice, Sarah's mother's voice. It clearly said, "Honey, are you there?" Sarah gasped and spun around, light trembling. That voice was etched in her memory, her mother who passed away 5 years prior. Hearing it again here, of all places, flooded her with emotion and alarm. Mike caught her as she stumbled back. The voice repeated, "Honey?" sounding concerned, exactly like a mother would, searching for her child. Tears pricked Sarah's eyes. "It's not real," she whispered to herself, remembering the site's law. She steadied herself and spoke loudly. "You're mimicking my mother. That's very cruel. Stop it." A giggle echoed, childlike but somehow malicious, down the long ward. Then all went quiet again. The meter spiked briefly and the temperature sensor on Mike's gear registered a sudden drop of 10 degrees Fahrenheit. "I think we riled it," Mike muttered. They decided to play back the recorder immediately to ensure they got those voices. They huddled near a window where moonlight gave a little illumination and listened through headphones together. Sure enough, the recorder had captured everything crisply. The whistling, Mike's mimic voice calling Sarah, and Sarah's mother's voice reply. That was gold evidence, but terrifying too. As they whispered about next steps, something happened that made both jump. The recorder, still in playback mode, suddenly emitted a new sound not originally there. A low, growling moan, rising into what sounded like a chorus of multiple voices overlapped, including their own voices, seemingly mocking their current whispers. It was as if the entity was manipulating the device in real time, playing back a twisted mirror of them. Mike cursed under his breath and stopped the playback. The overlapping mimicry ceased, but an oppressive feeling clung to the air. "That's enough for tonight," Sarah said shakily. They'd caught sensational evidence, no need to provoke further, especially as her normally skeptical nerves were fried. Mike readily agreed. They packed their gear swiftly, all the while feeling watched. As they left the ward, the stillness was broken one last time. From the darkness behind them came a perfect imitation of the show's producer's voice cheerily calling, "That's a wrap, folks," something he often said after filming. It echoed down the empty corridor with surreal joviality. Sarah and Mike hurried their steps, refusing to look back. They exited into the cool night, both shaking with adrenaline. The mimic presence did not follow them beyond the threshold of the hospital, at least not audibly. In the weeks after, their captured audio stunned viewers and fellow investigators. It was perhaps among the clearest mimicry EVPS recorded, multiple voices of known individuals reproduced beyond logical explanation. Skeptics posited that the old building's acoustics or radio interference might be involved, but analysis by sound engineers found no known source. The layered mimic on the recorder, even when they were silent, defied simple tech glitches. For Sarah, the experience had a profound effect. She found herself more open to the paranormal and more appreciative of her late mother's memory rather than unsettled. She rationalized that whatever the mimic was, it inadvertently gifted her one last hello from her mum, even if counterfeit. Mike took a hiatus from investigating. Hearing his own voice outside himself had deeply rattled his sense of identity. "It felt like part of me was stolen for a moment," he confided, an insight into how mimicry can strike at one's core. Their evidence remains one of the high watermarks in their web series, titled The Voice Thief episode, showing the enduring power of mimic phenomena even in the modern recorded era. It demonstrated that whatever haunted our ancestors with false familiar voices is still around, and now we can even play back its tricks for the world to hear. The investigators concluded their episode with a warning directly to any listening entities. "We know your game. We hear you, and we aren't fooled." Wise words, perhaps, for all who tread where echoes of the past roam hungry for attention. This case shows a modern investigative context, with technology capturing multiple mimic voices, illustrating how even in a controlled setting the phenomenon manifests. It touches on psychological impact on investigators and gives a somewhat open-ended conclusion, acknowledging the persistence of the phenomenon. In these 5 narrative case studies, from forest to home to road to historical legend to modern evidence, collectively illustrate the full scope of the mimicry phenomenon's settings and eras. In each, the voices of trust were twisted toward deceit, and in each, the human protagonists found ways, clever, faithful, or technological, to resist or at least document the uncanny encounter. Through them, one can feel the timeless fear and fascination that these echoing imposters instill, a testament to why the legend of those who sound like us endures, and why we still lean in at the campfire to hear one more story of the voice in the dark calling our name. From the dense forests of Eastern Europe to the wind-swept mesas of the American Southwest, from Old English manors to tropical Pacific isles, the motif of the deceptive familiar voice threads through culture after culture. Having journeyed through myriad examples, we can now draw together the parallels and note the variations shaped by geography and worldview. This cross-cultural comparison reveals that while details and interpretations differ, a forest spirit here, a demon there, a mischievous ghost elsewhere, the core pattern is remarkably consistent. Such ubiquity suggests something fundamental about human vulnerability and fear. Let's examine key commonalities as well as distinctive local color, and what they tell us about how environment and belief modulate the phenomenon of mimicry in law. One cannot help but be struck by the near universality of the mimic voice theme. Virtually every inhabited continent has legends of entities that lure or trick with voice imitation. The concept of a protective boundary appears everywhere. The idea that within the village or home one is safe, but beyond in liminal spaces, forest, mountains, deserts, the sea, unknown beings attempt to beguile the unwary, often via voice. Whether it's the Leshy at the edge of the Slav village, the Yakshi calling from Indian jungles, the duende or encantado in Latin American wilds, or skinwalkers on reservation outskirts, all serve as metaphors for the danger at civilization's fringes. The voice is a potent tool for these beings because it uniquely exploits social trust. We are predisposed to respond to a human cry for help or a loved one's call, so the trick is effective everywhere, indeed likely learned from human behavior. For instance, ancient hunters might have used animal calls to lure prey. Folklore simply flips that script. Now spirits use human calls to lure us as prey. Another common thread is the association with night darkness. Nearly all tales specify dusk or night for these encounters. This transcends culture, naturally, because darkness impairs verification. You can't easily see if that voice's source is who it claims. And also symbolically, darkness equals the unknown/chaos where deceptive forces reign. A midday mimic voice story is rare. If it happens by day, like Bell Witch speaking at noon, it's within a haunted house already itself a pocket of darkness. So, culturally, day is truth, night is lies manifest, a near universal dualism. Also widespread is the use of personal names, whether it's an African spirit calling a person's name, a Chinese ghost calling someone's soul by name, or a European fairy calling by nickname. The notion that hearing your name confers power to the caller is prevalent. Many traditions caution that answering to your name in a strange context gives the spirit hold over you. In psychological terms, indeed, our name is a key trigger for attention, so these stories emphasize not to let that reflex betray you. Furthermore, protective measures show parallels. Prayer or holy recitations appear in Abrahamic-influenced cultures, Bell Witch case, modern investigators, etc. In animist or shamanic cultures, offerings or counter-magic, like wearing clothes backwards in Slavic lore, or using corn pollen and speaking the entity's taboo name among Navajo. Almost always there's a recommended response if one hears such a voice. Either ignore it, the safest global advice, challenge it, like asking a question only the real person would know, or spiritually rebuke it as suits the culture's belief system. This consistency underscores that humanity didn't just fear this phenomenon, we developed strategies to cope with it. While the core fear remains the same, the trusted voice heard in the wrong place, the stories evolve with their surroundings. Geography and environment shape the face the mimic wears and the methods it uses to reach us. In the forests of Europe and North America, these entities take on the guise of guardians and tricksters. They are the Leshy of the Slavs, the Stick Indians of the Pacific Northwest, or witches hidden in green shadow. The thick woods amplify echoes and create natural illusions of sound, turning a single voice into many. In those regions, people often spoke of being drawn into swamps or tangled undergrowth by what sounded like a familiar call. Hunters told of hearing a child crying or a friend whistling the tune they always whistled, only to find the forest silent when they searched. In Japan's wooded mountains, where echoes travel for miles, the same phenomenon inspired a gentler spirit, the Yamabiko, a shy echo dweller who simply repeats what it hears. There, mimicry was play, not malice, a reminder that the world answers back. Across the deserts and plains of the world, the mimic's voice grows sharper, more deliberate. In the wide open spaces of the Navajo Nation or the Arabian Peninsula, sound carries far and distorts in the heat. Here arise the tales of the skinwalker and the jinn, shapeshifters whose voices mimic relatives or friends calling softly in the night. Travelers hear their names drifting across the sand and instinctively turn toward the call, though they know no one should be there. The emptiness itself becomes a stage for deception. A solitary voice in such vast silence is impossible to ignore. Among the Navajo, the teaching endures. When the night speaks your name, keep walking, for there are few enough living souls out there to call you truthfully. In the mountain ranges of the world, the Himalayas, the Andes, the Alps, the air thins and sound plays tricks. Here the call from nowhere often takes on a fatal cast. Himalayan climbers speak of unseen companions, calling to them by name, a voice that comforts or beckons during exhaustion. The Sherpa sometimes frame these as mountain spirits, banjankri, or other beings who test the climber's will. In the Andes, legends of the duende tell of miners or wanderers hearing a loved one's voice from a cave mouth and stepping toward their doom. Alpine villagers once warned of the Bergwichtel, creatures that mimic the cries of lost travelers to lure rescuers to the same cliff's edge. In every range, the pattern holds a name carried on the wind, an answering step, and then the plunge into silence. Along the coasts and islands, the voices ride the surf. Over the roar of waves, sailors and islanders alike have long claimed to hear the dead calling from the sea. In Polynesian tradition, the night marchers of Hawaii chant and call out names as they pass. To answer is to invite them closer. Off Caribbean shores, the sukuyon or the jambi sometimes imitate family voices, coaxing someone from the safety of their hut into the moonlit sand where the spirit has power. Geography shapes the lesson. In small coastal villages, leaving the home after dark meant leaving the circle of protection, and so the mimic's voice became the perfect temptation, a loved one asking you to step just a few feet too far. Even in the modern city, the mimic adapts but does not disappear. It hides in apartments and high-rises, speaking through walls instead of trees. A common urban legend tells of someone alone at night who hears their mother's voice calling from the hallway, though the mother is away. Others describe hearing a friend's voice echo under a bridge or from behind a pillar, only to find empty space. The constant noise of the city dulls the effect, but not entirely. In the late hours when streets empty and hum fades, the human ear still picks up those stray, impossible calls. Technology adds new dimensions, phantom voice messages, voicemails left by the dead, a loved one's tone echoing through static. The setting changes, but the structure of fear stays the same. A voice you know, in a place it cannot be, speaking words you long to hear. Across forests, deserts, mountains, and cities, the geography shifts, but the story holds its shape. The land dictates the acoustics, yet everywhere the voice remains the same, soft, familiar, and wrong. In more collective, close-knit societies, like a small tribe or village, mimic stories serve as collective warnings and reaffirm the group's importance. Don't trust the voice that isolates you from us. Stay with your community at night. In individualistic modern society, the fear might be more psychological. The idea of losing trust in one's own perception, hearing voices alone, is frightening as a potential mental break. So modern stories sometimes emphasize the psychological horror. I thought I was losing my mind when I heard my dead wife talk to me from the next room. Where older stories emphasize physical threat, don't leave the homestead or the forest spirit will get you. Both tie to vulnerability, one physical, one cognitive/spiritual. Ultimately, across cultures, this phenomenon reveals a deep fear, that of deception at the most intimate level, that one's senses and emotional bonds can betray. It hints at existential questions. How do we know what is real if even a beloved voice can be faked? Many cultures embed a spiritual answer, trust in faith/God, like reciting scripture to distinguish truth, or trust in the known quirks, like code words, or calling the bluff with secret knowledge. The persistent motif and defenses highlight that maintaining personal and communal identity, not answering to false calls, is a symbolic stand against chaos and evil that would devour that identity. We see mimicry ghosts in medieval folklore, like a 12th century English tale of a spirit imitating a man's wife's voice to tempt him out, in Walter Map's writings, through classic literature, Homer's Odyssey, Helen's mimicry trick, or in Gothic novels where a ghost voice calls protagonist's name from Moors, to the 21st century viral Reddit posts. It's a staple because it's effective narratively and psychologically, so culturally it's passed on not just as superstition, but as entertainment and even caution in modern paranormal community. In synthesizing, one sees that while a Navajo elder and a Russian peasant in 1800 would not know each other's specific beliefs, if they swapped stories, they'd nod in mutual understanding. Yes, we have those voices too, and we know not to follow them. It's a remarkable case of convergent tradition. Similar solutions, don't respond, challenge it, rely on prayers, arising independently. It's also fascinating that some cultures personify it, Leshy Jin, with motives, guard the forest, trick humans, while others treat it as residually human, ghosts of dead playing tricks or demons testing faith. This alters how the phenomenon is morally framed. In one place it might be almost morally neutral. A Leshy is a protector, albeit dangerous, So if you respect forest, it won't bother you. Whereas in Christian context, it's pure evil to demonic, out to ensnare souls regardless of human behavior. Yet the experience described, the felt fear, the recognition of mimicry's unnaturalness, is essentially the same. So interpretation is layered atop a common experiential core. That we fear mimicry so much points to how central authentic communication and trust are to human society. A violation of that, a lie via voice, is a taboo of sorts, encoded in myth as monstrous. It reminds that voice often equates with self. Hearing one's own voice externally is almost like seeing one's doppelganger, an omen of death in many folklore. Some have indeed equated hearing one's phantom voice with impending death too. So the motif persists not only because of external dangers, but because it triggers a deep, uncanny sense of self-dislocation and betrayal. It also shows humans use narrative to cope. By telling stories of these encounters, communities symbolically control them. Naming the demon gives power over it, or at least warns everyone. The enduring motif, thus, is a cultural mechanism of both catharsis, we face the fear in story, and precaution, we pass down how to handle it. In conclusion, examining mimicry voices cross-culturally highlights that, while our rational surfaces differ, one culture says demon, another says sprite. Underneath, we all guard a fragile trust in what we hear, and we all feel the same shiver when that trust is shaken. Our collective stories, whether told around yurts, campfires, or internet forums, reinforce a shared human caution. When the night calls your name with a loved one's tongue, be wary, for not all that sounds familiar is friendly. Having wandered through these haunting tales and analyses, one might well ask, what should we do, we ordinary people, if ever the familiar feels wrong? If one night we hear a voice we trust in a context that doesn't make sense? Beyond the folklore and the fright, what can these stories teach us about navigating such moments of uncertainty and fear? This section steps back from narrative and distills some practical guidelines and reflective insights that emerge from the law and cases we've explored. Whether one leans skeptical and sees these as psychological events or believes earnestly in spirits, the advice often aligns. At its core, it's about maintaining composure, critical thinking, and a grounded sense of self when confronted with the uncanny. Let's outline a few key takeaways. If you ever hear your name called and you can't immediately locate the source, say you're certain the person whose voice it is shouldn't be there, the best immediate response is, do not rush toward it. Folklore in every language basically suggests not answering, or at least not blindly following the voice. Instead, take a moment, ground yourself, realize your adrenaline will spike, and that's okay. It's a natural alarm. Use that clarity to scan the environment. Is the voice exactly accurate, or are there subtle differences? Many recount noticing a tiny distortion once they overcome the initial shock. If it's calling from outside into your house, do not step out. If it's calling you into an isolated area, stay where you have some safety. Essentially, treat it as you would an unknown caller on the phone. Don't give away the private information of your trust until you confirm identity. It's easy to doubt yourself in such moments. Am I imagining this? Maintain a healthy skepticism both ways. Question the reality of the voice and the impulse to respond. Remind yourself of alternative explanations. Could it be a prankster, an echo, a bird or animal mimic? Or if one believes in spirits, could it be one known to do this, and therefore not truly your loved one, but something tricking you? By analyzing instead of instinctively reacting, you shift from prey to problem solver. Many stories had protagonists realize in the nick of time, wait, that can't be real because X reason. Arm yourself with that reasoning. For instance, if you know your spouse is at work, hearing them at home logically means something's off. Cling to logic even as fear tries to drown it, because logic might save you from running straight into danger, be it an actual physical hazard or the metaphorical clutches of a spirit. If the impossible ever happens and you hear that familiar voice in an unfamiliar place, there are ways to respond that can keep you grounded. The goal isn't to perform magic, but to assert your own reality, to take back control of the moment before fear or curiosity does it for you. If you are a person of faith, follow the example found in so many of these stories. Invoke a higher power. A simple prayer, mantra, or protective verse does two things at once. Spiritually, it is said to repel whatever dark or deceptive force might be present. Psychologically, it anchors you in something strong and familiar. The act of speaking sacred or comforting words steadies the breath, sharpens focus, and replaces panic with purpose. Those who come from cultures with physical symbols of protection, corn pollen, holy water, a charm or talisman, should use them exactly as tradition prescribes. Even if you don't believe an object has literal power, the ritual of using it reminds you of safety and community. Familiar gestures calm the mind, and a calm mind is your best defense against anything that tries to unsettle it. If the voice you hear truly sounds like someone you know, test it. Ask a question only the real person could answer. The bells did this during their haunting, inventing a code word only they knew. You can do the same. If you hear your sister's voice calling from the hallway, when you know she's away, ask something only she would know. What's our dog's name? Or, where did we go last summer? Silence or hesitation can be more revealing than an answer. A mimic rarely has the depth of memory that truth carries. When fear begins to close in, seek light and company. Nearly every story tells of the voices fading once another person arrived, or a lamp was turned on. Darkness and isolation empower these experiences. Turning on lights, opening a door, calling someone on the phone, all these actions break the stillness that such phenomena feed on. Even speaking aloud, "I'm not alone, I'm getting help," can be enough to snap the spell, whether it deters a human prankster or something stranger. And above all, do not follow. Every cautionary tale across centuries comes back to this rule. The voice may sound desperate, it may sound like love itself, but resist the instinct to move toward it. Stop where you are and verify. If you think someone might truly need help, call their phone, shout a practical question, or alert others before stepping forward. A real person in trouble will respond naturally. A false voice may vanish or turn hostile once challenged. If it persists and you are certain it is not what it claims to be, act according to your instincts and beliefs. Some traditions teach to confront it directly. Name it, rebuke it, command it to leave. Others insist you should never engage at all. The stories offer both outcomes: the Bell Witch silenced by prayer, and other mimics defeated only when ignored. The right choice depends on what feels right to you in that moment. If speaking to it makes the situation feel worse, then fall into silence, focus on steady breathing, and walk away without haste. Whether through faith, light, logic, or sheer composure, the key is the same. Do not surrender your sense of self to the fear the voice inspires. Every mimic's weapon is the panic it stirs. Every survivor's strength is the calm that refuses to answer back. We've seen how these stories themselves equip people with awareness. Continue that tradition in modern guise. If you experience something like this, share it, as our witnesses in analysis did. Not for sensationalism, but to let others know, "Hey, I encountered this weird thing. Here's how I realized it wasn't real." In olden days, a grandmother's tale of nearly being lured by a forest voice might have saved a grandchild from the same fate. Today, a Reddit post might do similarly for a reader who one day hears a phantom call and recalls, "Wait, I read about this. I should be cautious." In short, knowledge reduces fear. Even fictional horror stories about mimics ironically help listeners practice the scenario in their head. If that were me, I'd do X. It's like a mental vaccine. Embrace that cultural wisdom rather than dismiss it out of hand. On a more reflective note, mimicry phenomena urge a kind of mindful skepticism in daily life. They highlight the value of verifying truth, not taking everything at face or voice value. A lesson applicable far beyond ghosts. Think of scam calls, as mentioned, or even interpersonal relations. Is that friend's flattery genuine or a manipulative mimic of care? In a way, the paranormal motif is an allegory for deception in human interactions. Learning to trust but verify, to listen to context and intuition, like Maggie Bell noticing the not quite right in Jim's voice, is a skill these tales encourage. So practically, if something feels off about even a normal situation, someone's tone doesn't match their words, etc., heed that. Our brains are good at detecting subtle wrongness, the uncanny valley effect we discussed. So don't brush aside those gut signals. whether facing a ghostly voice or a possibly deceitful person. Finally, if one does encounter something like this, it's important afterwards to ground oneself in reality and community. Many in our stories found solace in prayer, family support, or taking assertive action, like the investigators who captured evidence and analyzed it, rather than succumbing to nightmares. Fear can be traumatizing if you feel alone with it. Sharing your experience with understanding people, as John and Lucy Bell did with each other, immediately, or Kyle and Daniel talked it out after their skinwalker scare, helps to mentally process and diminish the fear's power. Sometimes simply flipping on all the lights and reminding yourself that in daylight clarity, things are different, can break the lingering hold of a nighttime fright. Above all, remember that if indeed these phenomena are real, in a supernatural sense, cultures worldwide show they are not omnipotent. Humans routinely outsmart or ward off the mimics with pretty basic means: words, faith, clever tests, sometimes pure refusal to engage. In other words, the power ultimately lies with us to not give them what they want, our attention or compliance. This is an empowering thought. When all the stories and warnings are distilled, the same simple lessons emerge, practical, timeless, and as clear as the folklore that first taught them. If a voice calls to you from nowhere, don't rush to answer. Pause long enough to confirm what's real. The impulse to respond immediately is powerful, but it's also what these encounters rely on. Keep your mind steady. Fear and confusion cloud judgment faster than any spirit could. Remind yourself what should be possible and use that logic as your anchor. If you need something to focus on, reach for the tools that feel right to you. A quiet prayer, a protective phrase, a question only the real person could answer, or simply the decision to ignore the call and walk away. Each of these acts places the control back in your hands. Seek connection instead of isolation. Turn on lights, call a friend, speak aloud to let the room know you are not alone. Solitude feeds the phenomenon. Company, whether human or divine, breaks it. And finally, remember that every tale we've heard, every survivor's account, exists because someone chose to share it. Pass those lessons on. Each story told is another light against the dark, another reminder that knowledge itself can protect. The more we speak about these encounters, the less power they have to frighten us. In that sense, wisdom becomes a charm of its own, turning fear into understanding and the unknown into something we can face together. By internalizing these lessons, one can transform the deep-seated fear these voices provoke into a cautious respect and readiness. The false familiar relies on surprise and emotional exploitation. Forewarned, we are far less likely to be taken by surprise or swayed by emotion. Thus, even if one never encounters a phantom voice, and hopefully most won't, these teachings have broader use. They train us to listen critically, trust our instincts, and uphold the sanctity of genuine communication in all areas of life. To always question, as the old saying goes, whether the call in the dark is a friend or a foe before we answer, "I'm here." In the hush that follows the telling of such tales, one may find oneself, like a wary traveler at dusk, listening a little harder to the voices carried on the wind, questioning for a moment even the most ordinary call of one's name. We have traversed a long road together, from ancient forests echoing with trickster laughter, to quiet bedrooms where a loved one's voice spoke when it shouldn't, from communal campfire warnings to the cold scrutiny of modern recorders. And through it all runs that spine-tingling motif. They sound like us, those unknown forces, whether spirits, demons, or the mysterious recesses of our own minds, sound just like us and thus find a way into our trust, our fear, our very hearts. What have we uncovered on this journey? We've seen that this phenomenon, call it the mimic, the doppelganger voice, the calling ghost, is not a product of one culture's imagination alone, but a pan-human experience or caution, as old as we have had language and love to be exploited. The voices in the dark that imitate the familiar are in a sense a shadow of humanity's social nature. They exist in folklore as the antithesis of the true familiar voices that give us comfort. Perhaps that is why they horrify so. They are the betrayal of intimacy, the predator's camouflage in the shape of our emotional bonds. Yet, there is another side to this final reflection. Throughout the accounts, what ultimately saved protagonists was often the very thing the entities perverted: genuine love, faith, and identity. A husband and wife unmask the witch's impersonation by knowing each other's souls. A boy is protected from the false grandma voice by the real grandmother's teachings. Investigators find truth by literally replaying the lie and hearing it for what it is. Time and again, knowledge and sincere connection prove stronger than deceit. In a way, the persistent legend of the mimic is a tribute to the value of authenticity. For every story of a false voice luring someone to danger, there are stories of communities reaffirming how to tell truth from trickery. The secret name, the code word, the intuition that mom would never say it like that. In the darkest moments, confronted with a flawless illusion of their beloved's voice, our protagonists found within themselves the clarity to say, "No, I know who you are, and you are not them." That defiance, that ability to hold on to the real against the imitation, is a quiet triumph of the human spirit, repeated across cultures and eras. As we close this exploration, perhaps it's fitting to bring it back to a personal present thought experiment. Picture yourself in your home tonight. The hour is late, the house settled. Suddenly you hear someone you deeply care about, a spouse, a parent, a dear friend, call out to you from the next room. How will you respond? Will you recall some of the wisdom gleaned here? Maybe call them on the phone first to double check they aren't elsewhere? Will you utter a protective phrase taught by your grandparents? Or will you freeze, as the ancestors warned, and remain silent until the voice fades with a frustrated hiss? The choice ultimately is yours, as it was for those in our stories, and that might be the final meditation the motif offers. Even when confronted with the uncanny, we retain agency. The breaking of trust by an outside force is not the end of the story. How we meet that breach is. We see characters meeting it with courage, wit, prayer, sometimes a scream and a retreat. But they lived to tell the tale, or others told it for them. And by telling, they reclaim the power the mimic tried to steal. In the quiet hall of our imagination now, the lecture done, perhaps one faint question lingers like a half-heard echo. If someday your name drifts to you on an impossible voice, will you answer, or will you remain silent? It's a question as old as fear. The stories suggest silence or refusal is often the wiser path, yet each person must in that moment weigh heart and mind. We conclude not with a definitive solution, for the unknown rarely grants us such luxury, but with a sense of resolution nonetheless. We have armed ourselves with awareness. Should a voice in the dark ever call to you with perfect familiarity, you will remember the shared knowledge of generations and this exploration. You will know to question, to seek the true face behind the voice, and above all, to hold fast the trust in the genuine loved ones that no spectre can sunder. That is the lamp we carry out of these stories into our own lives, a lamp of discernment and unity to hold against the deceptive shadows. And perhaps, just perhaps, if ever you feel the weight of a gaze at midnight, or a call that prickles your neck, you will recall this journey and the chorus of humanity whispering alongside you. We hear it too. You are not alone. In that realization lies the final banishment of the mimic's power, for it thrives on isolating and fooling, and we have, across time and culture, refused to be isolated or fooled for long. The long night of our discussion ends. Morning's logic and comfort return. We step back into the world of known voices, the chatter of day, the greetings of friends, the simple good morning that is unmistakably real. Those other voices, the ones that sound like us but aren't, recede into myth and memory, until dusk falls again, and somewhere to someone they come a-calling. Should it be you, now you know what to do. Listen, think, and if need be, do not answer. Let the final words be those of a wise old proverb echoed in many tongues. Not every call is meant to be answered. So ends our exploration, with the hope that these hard-won lessons from frightened hearts past will guide whatever uncertain roads lie ahead, and that the only voices you answer swiftly are the ones you know in your soul to be true. Stay safe, stay wise, and when in doubt, stay silent. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. From ancient forests to city hallways, the same voice keeps calling, always familiar, always wrong. a mother, a lover, a friend. It never changes its trick because it doesn't have to. We still turn our heads when we hear our names. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening, for keeping the lights low and the mind open. These stories aren't meant to frighten for sport. They're warnings passed down in every language on earth. So, when the night goes quiet and you hear something soft and familiar calling from another room, stop and think, because sometimes the most dangerous thing in the dark isn't a stranger. It's the sound of someone you love. The goal is 20,000 subscribers, and every one of you brings us closer. Thank you for listening. Until next time, sleep well, stay safe, and if you hear your name when you know you're alone, don't answer.